And we're live. Welcome everybody to the chat. Thanks to everyone for listening afterwards. We have a very special four-person panel here. We are counting down each of our top 5 greatest fights in boxing history. Greatest meaning whatever we felt like it meant in the moment when we made the list. My guests are 86 Boxing. What's up, 86?
Hey, how's it going, Random? Excited to be here, especially on this panel. Feels special, so I'm looking forward to this countdown, and I think it should be fun and exciting.
Great to have you, sir. We also have the Boxing Librarian from Hardline Boxing Talk. Hardline, what's up, brother?
Yeah, I'm really good, Random. Thank you. Big shout out to 86 Boxing and my friend Scrapbook Boxing and yourself. And to all the listeners, I'd just like to say I've apologised to the gents behind the scenes, but to those listeners who were looking forward to catching this live stream last time, I was a bit tardy. My apologies to anyone who was looking forward to listening to this chat. But here we are now, and I'm hoping it's going to be a great chat.
I'm so looking forward to this. I'm sure everyone is. And last but not least, Scrapbook Boxing. Scrapbook, what's happening, sir?
I'm good, Random. How are you today? I hope things are well. 86 and BL, is a pleasure to be on the panel with you. BL, you have no worries. We would never do that live without you. So if we had to wait another week after this one, we would have done so.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Scrapbook.
Yep. And real quick, in the shouts in the chat, Bruce and Martin, thanks, guys. Great to see you. Thanks to everyone who shows up. I'm going to try not to accidentally do something goofy with my little program on my phone here, so I may not be in the chat the whole time, but thanks everyone just for sharing a little bit of time with us while we talk about this great sport. So we have a 4-person panel. We've done different topics, the 3 of us, BL, Scrap, and myself, and now we're going to load it up with a 4-person attack. And I think 86, Josh, you're going to go first, is that correct? With your number 5 greatest fight of all time.
Yes, that is right. I'm going number 4, and I kind of entered a little cheat code here, so I actually have 2 fights that are being wrapped into one in some sense. It's just we didn't have any set criteria, so I was thinking about those fights that I personally just like to watch and brought a level of excitement for me. So the first being actually a 2011 fight. It was between Hernan Tyson Marquez and Luis Elnica Concepcion. So this took place in Panama City, Panama for the WBA flyweight title. It was actually April 2nd, 2011. It ended up, I believe, being the fight of the year for 2011, or at least in a lot of publications, I would say. But there was nothing necessarily fancy or flashy about this fight. It was just what it is in the sense, a straight up fight. It was 2 guys who were going in there to try and tear each other's heads off. And it stuck out with me just because of the level of intensity for the fight in itself overall. These 2 would go on to fight some additional times, but it wasn't quite like this first fight. And it's one of those situations. It was Panama. It wasn't widely covered by the network, so you can find some of the fight coverage, and you can actually find it in its entirety if you dig out there on YouTube. But it was one that delivered in a major way if you're just into the excitement, the unpredictable nature of boxing in itself. And these were 2 smaller guys, so usually we don't see them get as much love there on the networks. We've started to see a bit of it as time has gone on. Some have had the opportunity to be able to fight on a major stage, but these guys generally always bring it. They usually throw a lot of punches, and they're usually going to be exciting fights whenever you have some of these smaller guys matched up. These 2, Tyson Marquez and Concepcion, they traded knockdowns in the first round. It was an epic first round. I mean, both of them were hurt after getting dropped. And then from there, it was just a level of excitement just because of the fact that you were just kind of anticipating what would happen next. And I don't know what the relationship of the 2 fighters was like coming in, but it just seemed that they were dead set on just really destroying the other person in that particular fight. And Concepcion, he actually took the worst of it overall, and he would go on to actually lose the fight. but it's just the way that he went about trying to attack Marquez. It was just this is just ruthless aggression. He was taking a ton of damage, but it wasn't bending him at all. He didn't care what he was getting hit with in that moment, and that's what you look for, those guys with that raw intensity and that mental strength, because he was getting hit with bombs, but he kept coming forward. And I don't know if he threw a jab the entire fight. He was just dead set on landing his right hand, and he found success when he was landing it. You could tell it was thudding and it could do damage. But in the end, Marquez, he was able to withstand, and he ultimately prevailed. And I think that this fight, for those that haven't seen it, is one of those here since it's 2011, here within the last 10 plus years, that I think ranks as one of the great ones that probably went a little bit under the radar as far as mainstream boxing is concerned. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And then I wrapped in a mix there what you all probably see on the picture, which is Oscar De La Hoya versus Fernando Vargas. That's just one for me that is one of my personal favorites. I just recall this was 2002, actually, September 14th. I just recall coming into the fight, man, there was just so much animosity. And I felt that it was one of those situations where you have Oscar, the golden boy. He's looking like the good guy here. And then Fernando Vargas, he's representing real Mexicans, or at least that's what he was presenting. And he just seemed like he was the bully there. And that left you in one of those situations, like what is actually going to happen when we get into this fight? As far as the war of words were concerned, I felt that Fernando Vargas, man, he was so intense, and I felt he won that war of words. So coming into it, I'm sure a lot of people thought that he was going to get the edge, and I know a lot of the a lot of Mexicans were backing him, and he went with that stick of being like the real Mexican. Oscar just being one of these pretty boys who's kind of had it easy coming up. And I just remember all the build up with the press conference and everything. And then you could just see, even day of fight, just the intensity on these guys. Now, I wasn't able to watch the actual fight live at this particular time. Of course, I was younger and didn't have the opportunity to do so. So I just remember just waiting and being on Sports Center at the time, trying to see when they came in with the sort of results or highlights of the fight, which they usually for boxing only gave it maybe 40 to 50 seconds. So it couldn't have summed up everything in totality. But in hindsight, of course, I've gone back and watched this fight several times, and I thought it lived up to the billing. It started out with Fernando Vargas being the aggressor, and you could tell that he was a strong fighter, and he was in top form. He was in great shape, and for a minute there, it looked like he was actually going to give it to Oscar, who was actually feeling his punches. You can tell at times, and he had Oscar backing up at points, and it was a matter of, is Fernando going to be able to continue to do this all night, and would he actually be able to land something to get Oscar out of there? But I think Oscar showed in a major way like what he's built of. I'm a fan of Oscar De La Hoya as a fighter, and I thought he showed in that fight that everything he had put in and anticipated for in training, all the years that he had put into the sport, he just showed that he was a level above for this particular night, and he battled back, and he ended up stopping Fernando Vargas. And I know it had to be a hard pill to swallow for Vargas because of the fact that he had so much bravado, and I think he was really being backed in this fight, and it looked like he was going to be the one to take over there for a bit. But we know the rest of history and everything. But I thought this was probably one of the better performances for both. Definitely in terms of when you look at the total package, just the build up and then how this fight actually ended up playing out. So I thought I would certainly throw this one on the list, and I'll pass it on from here. So thank you. That's my number 5 right there.
Fantastic. And I think we agreed BL will go twice. Go right ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Random. Good job, 86. Good job. I would like to say my 5th fight. Okay, the first of my 5. I am putting them in, well, kind of a loose order, but My fifth fight I'm actually going to choose may be a bit controversial to some, okay, because the fight I'm actually choosing is one of the 5 greatest fights in boxing history, in terms of either historic thing or fight itself. Is actually Mayweather-Pacquiao, a fight that did not really live up to the billing, but a fight that enamored the entire world. The entire boxing community had been wanting to see this fight for 8 years, and despite all the stalled negotiations and the excuses from both camps and the nonsense, and you know, the negotiations went on too long. It was overbuilt. It was built up for too long. Okay, it should have happened a number of years before, but we did finally get the fight. Now, the prominence of these two fighters is one thing that factors into it, because Floyd Mayweather, you know, by 2007-8, it was pound-pound number one in world. Pacquiao was coming up through the weights from this point, coming through, you know, super bantam feather, super feather, approaching, you know, lightweight, and then ready for welterweight. He'd come to welterweight, you know, a similar time as when just after Floyd Mayweather had retired. And when Floyd went into that retirement after beating Ricky Hatton, he was pretty much the best fighter in the world, pretty much consensus the best fighter in the world. When Floyd retired, Pacquiao pretty much became the consensus best fighter in the world. And I think that when you add that prominence of both fighters, both of them multi-year pound-for-pound number one rated fighters, both of them achieved incredible things. You know, yes, the build-up was too long and there was too much nonsense around it, but it did generate into when the fight finally did happen in 2015. The fight was just so huge, and even though some people were saying, "Oh, I'm bored of this fight, I don't want to see it, it took too long," as I was saying, it's taken too long, I'm losing interest in it. You know, this fight made over 400 million in revenue. Early pay-per-view estimates were a bit low. It made over 400 million in revenue. Gate receipts of something ridiculous like over 70 million. You know, some tickets were on sale at like what, 7,500, 3,000, 2,000. I mean, this was an enormous fight, a huge fight, a historically significant fight. It was also a unification fight, unifying 3 at welterweight titles, leaving only Kell Brook's IBF welterweight title out of the mix. And, you know, the fight didn't really live up to billing, but I don't really blame Floyd Mayweather for that, like many people do, just like I don't blame, you know, Willie Pep or Loche or Pernell Whitaker or any of these stylists, these defensive wizards. I don't really blame them if their opponents are not able to push them in a ring. Okay, that is their opponent's job to do. And if the opponent cannot adequately push that opponent in the ring, you know, then that's their business. You know, Willie Pep had outboxed people left, right, and centre. Loche couldn't be hit. You know, Pernell Whitaker, he'd fight world-rated fighters, and he'd fight them like he was just in a park playing five-a-side soccer. I mean, he was smiling and acting jovial, and then he'd go in and put boxing masterclasses on people. So I don't really blame Mayweather for Pacquiao's inability to force the fight more. You know, Pacquiao himself said a quote. It was something like, "Oh, we're moving around so much, I found it hard to throw punches." Well, that's exactly the point, Manny. Okay, Floyd offset your offense. Okay, because Floyd is not only defensive master like Loche, like Pepper, like Pernell Whitaker, but those guys were not only defensive masters, they were also great ring generals. They knew how to maintain and control the range. They knew how to use angles. They knew how to use the ring combined with their defensive skills, you know, and also all of those fighters in their own way could become aggressive fighters as well. They were very successful aggressively when they chose to work that option. Even Pernell Whitaker taking people out with single shot counters to the body, you know. So ultimately the fight didn't live up to billing, okay, but it was something like half of all Filipino households showed the fight. You know, there were almost record sponsorships for the fight, there were record pay-per-views for the fight, even counting for all the massive amount of millions or tens of millions, as heavens knows what the real number would be, who illegally streamed the fight. It still smashed every pay-per-view record in the sport, and it was between the two greatest fighters of that period in boxing meeting up. Yes, albeit a few years too late, but still meeting up regardless. Okay, and that's why I put that as one of my 5 biggest fights in boxing history.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that brings us to Scrapbook Boxing. Sir, it is now your number 5.
For one, I want to give 86 praise on his choice and his deliberation. Very good job. BL, outstanding. A lot of the points that you made on the Mayweather and Pacquiao bout is significance to boxing history and what's going on today. And I think that was a very important dialogue that you just ran off on this particular fight because it's a good way to gauge what should be happening and what could still happen if guys would decide to make that transition and get into the ring with one another. So that's very, very important. So that was a great
Well
job.
said, Strap. Thank you. Well said.
Absolutely. My number 5 happened in the year September 12, 1951 with Ray Robinson and Randy Turpin. Now, they fought twice, and I'm going to do something that 86 had done. I'm going to combine the first and second fight to make my point. The first fight was very, very important because it showed that Ray Robinson or any fighter of magnitude is human. They're human. And what Ray Robinson didn't bank on was that Randy Turpin could have his number. Randy Turpin had a grandfather who was a bare-knuckle fighter, and he was a defensive wizard, his grandfather was. And the shoulder shifting and the dip of Randy Turpin is what confused Ray Robinson. Now, Ray Robinson came off of a tour, a 7-fight tour. He fought in several countries, and Randy Turpin was his 7th professional fight on that tour. He was out doing whatever he was doing. He had his wife with him. He had 3 suitcases of mink coats and furs, and he had suits and everything else. His mind has nothing to do with Randy Turpin's performance, but his mind was not gauged where it should have been gauged, and he deserved to lose the fight because if you are a true professional, you need to go in there and make no excuses. As Ray Robinson never made an excuse for his loss, but because of his loss, I think is what actually made this fight, the next fight, their second fight, at the Polo Grounds, as magnificent as it was. But in their first fight, it took place July 10th, 1951. Why this is significant, and I'll explain that at the end of my point here. They fought at the Earl's Court Arena in Kingston, London, United Kingdom. It was 18,000 people witnessed this particular fight. Ray Robinson was coined pound for pound in this particular era of boxing because he could do everything. Between welterweight to heavyweight, they felt as though his skill set could beat every weight division had he moved up to those weight divisions better than any other fighter up to Joe Louis. Ray Robinson was the 5th black middleweight champion in boxing history. He was the 3rd black welterweight boxing fighter in boxing history. So he had a lot going into this particular match. But I believe he took it for granted, and he would wind up losing this particular fight. Now, Randy Turpin, what was so specific about him? He had a brother named Dick Turpin, who was the first black fighter to win a championship of any kind in Britain. Randy Turpin would be the 2nd black fighter of any kind to win, in this case, a middleweight championship title. He was the first one in Great Britain. He was the 2nd fighter since Ruby Robb in 1894 to win the middleweight championship title. He would win it from the greatest middleweight champion, as they would say, Ray Robinson. There was a lot of significance to the performance that Randy Turpin would put on. In the second fight, September 12th, 1951, $230,000 was awarded to Ray Robinson. $210,000 was awarded to Randy Turpin. Turpin walked into the ring weighing 159 pounds, and Ray Robinson walked into the ring weighing 157 pounds. They would fight at the New York Polo Grounds. 2 judges, 1 referee. Referee was Ruby Goldstein. What was interesting about the first fight was that you had no judges in England. You only had a referee. And at the end of that fight, the referee would raise Randy Turpin's hand without announcing the winner. And that was his way of saying that Randy Turpin was the new champion. You didn't have a judge in that first fight. You had 2 judges in the second fight, including the referee, which was Ruby Goldstein. Now, Ray Robinson has suffered a laceration over his left eye, and he was down on the card of this fight because of that cut. He was in danger of losing the fight. Ruby Goldstein, this was very interesting.
Hey, I think the feed might have broken up.
Oh, can you guys hear me?
Hey, yes.
Yeah, it's just all gone quiet.
Did Scrap cut off? Oh, we must have lost him. I think he
so.
bounced up.
Yeah.
I thought it was my phone, so I exited out and came back in. But Scrap lost all. Do you guys want to say anything about this rivalry? BL, do you have anything you want to touch on this while Scrap comes back?
No, not really. I think Scrap's done a great job of that one. You know, it is, like you said, significance of a legendary upset, probably one of the greatest upsets in boxing history, if not the greatest upset in boxing history. You know, Turpin had a very difficult style. The Tickler, very good fighter indeed, goes a bit underrated, especially in UK boxing circles. And Ray Robinson probably did take him a little bit easy, not realizing that they were getting in ring with a very clever, very capable fighter. And, you know, I think leading into rematch, he was in trouble again. Okay, we're again having a very difficult fight with Turpin. And he suffered, I think, a bad cut over his eye until he found them great punches to get rid of him with that massive salvo of brutal looks in 10th round. But yeah, it's certainly a highly significant fight.
Yeah, shout out to Slow Joe. Yeah, check this out tomorrow. Sorry, go ahead, 86.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm in agreement. These are the fights that introduced me to Randy Turpin and had me sort of look into his career, of course, through Sugar Ray Robinson. And when I think Turpin, I can't help but think of these fights with Robinson, as I think they are great standout fights in history. And when you're telling the story of boxing's history, I think the rivalry between these two is one that has to be and should be mentioned. So great fighters, both of them. Interesting styles for Turpin, as BL mentioned, and then of course we all know Ray Robinson. Many regard him as the greatest of all the fighters. So this was an excellent pick for Scrapbook.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm thinking, I guess pending his return, let's just proceed, and then he can, when he gets to his next pick, his number 4, he can finish up if he had additional thoughts on that. Sound good?
Yeah. Has anybody heard from him?
No, I haven't, but I've got my eye open in case he for when he comes back to the chat. Okay, yeah. I think he's back. I see a guest.
Great.
Okay, hold on a second. Okay, welcome back, Scrap. Please proceed.
Yeah, I don't know where I left off, where I got disconnected.
We tried to fill in a bit for your Scrap. We tried to add on that it was one of boxing's greatest upsets, and Turpin had a very difficult style, and Robinson may have underestimated him a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Well, basically, what I was getting at, I had finished before I realized I was disconnected. But the bottom line is why this fight was so significant, because I went on to the first fight and then the second fight. The first fight, you had no judges. You only had a referee. That referee would raise the hand of Randy Turpin at the end of the fight, indicating that he was winner. He didn't say whether he won or lost. He just raised his hand. He was the only judge in that fight. You didn't have any judges in the first fight. In the second fight, you had 2 judges plus the referee, who was Rudy Goldstein. And Goldstein would say to Ray Robinson that you're going to have to do something, otherwise I have to stop this. He would go ahead and knock out Randy Turpin. What I was saying was that what was so interesting about this was in 1951, I'm not sure if you guys got that part, but it was very, very, they investigated that year because there was a lot of fixed fights going on during that time. But Ezra Charles, Willie Pep, Ike Williams, and Jimmy Bivens, all these men turned professional in 1940. In 1951, all but Bivens, although Bivens lost to Joe Louis in 51, but the rest of these men all lost their titles in 51, including Ray Robinson, including Jake LaMotta, because I consider him a 1940 fighter. He lost it to Ray Robinson himself. But Ray Robinson was the only fighter to regain his title in the same year in 1951. And that made that very interesting. But what was interesting also, that same year was they investigated so many of those fights because they had the chocolate ice cube Tommy Campbell who defeated Joe Brown, which they couldn't believe as well. So with so many things going on in 51. But that's why I chose Randy Turpin and Ray Robinson as my fifth fight. Both fight one and fight two together because it was such an interesting story between those two men. Randy Turpin was the first Black British fighter who would become a middleweight champion in boxing history. He was the second British middleweight of all time behind Ruby Robb Fitzsimmons. That was 1894. And his brother Dick Turpin was the first Black fighter of any weight and to win any form of a title. So that was very interesting. But I got to tell you, these two men put on a performance of a lifetime in both stadiums, especially in the Polo Grounds, because it was so significant. So that's why I wanted to choose Randy Turpin and Ray Robinson, both fight one and fight two.
Fantastic. So I'm not sure about you guys, but I struggled not only with creating a top five or even figuring out what I was trying to do criteria-wise, but also the order they came in. So I'm not even sure the order, but the fights I ended up going with, they're important in different ways. This one...
Random, before you start, if I could just add another quick point in to back Scrapbook.
Oh, please be my guest.
Well, 2 points. Just to back Scrap's talk on significance of that fight is point one, it ended Ray Robinson's 91 fight unbeaten streak. But point two, when Robinson lost that fight, due to him losing that fight, when he won the rematch that same year that Scrapbook mentioned, he joined Zale Ketchel as a two-time middleweight champion, tying the most times middleweight champion.
Great point. Yes, absolutely correct. That is a fact.
Yeah,
sorry, Random. I just wanted to add that into back Scrapbook.
Great point right there. Yeah, because it's hard when you get to the top. I mean, we all know a lot of great fighters sometimes only got one opportunity or never got an opportunity for a full world title. A lot of politics in boxing, and managing to get back to the top is something special, especially when you're talking about when you get into the realm of like undisputed status and things like that. Getting back to the very top, the undisputed top, as it were, is something special, always worth celebrating in our great fighters. So my number five could easily have been number one. It's actually the fight that comes to mind. For me, this is the greatest recruiting tool the sport of boxing has available to it currently. And the action was unparalleled. In fact, if you ask a lot of fans, casual or otherwise, the greatest fight of all time, as far as the greatest battle, like the most insane and thrilling collision, they come up with this one right here. Double H. We got Hagler Hearns. Two greats of their generation, stylistically different, stylistically brilliant, very powerful, expert boxers, both ferocious. And the fight they put on, I have a feeling this is going to come up, so I'm not actually going to go too deep into it, but the fight they put on is the stuff of legend in and amongst all the legendary stuff. Just if you want to get someone into boxing, just go watch that fight. Go see Hagler Hearns. Start there and branch out from there. That's the recruiting tool. That's how good that was. That's how incredible it was. And styles make fights, but also approaches make fights. And this fight had some surprises in how the participants went about it, and that's part of what made it so great. Is it was whereas say something like Mayweather Pacquiao, huge fight structurally, enormous moneymaker, great fighters of their generation again, but the action didn't deliver. This was the kind of fight where you go, this is going to be a banger, and then you couldn't even suspect how intense it was going to be. I'm not going to go any deeper into this fight because I'm pretty sure it comes up. If it doesn't come up again, I might retouch on it at the end. We can all do that, by the way, guys, at the end of the talk, if you want to bring up any of these fights that we didn't get to add on to. So that made my number five, and it could easily have been number one because I do consider it probably the greatest, as far as that's on film, the greatest collision, what I would consider the greatest collision of boxers. And then now that brings us back down to our number four selection, 86. It's on you, brother.
All right, great choice there, Random. So my number four, now this wasn't much of a fight, but it's a standout fight for me. And this is Mike Tyson versus Leon Spinks, or Michael Spinks, rather. Sorry. June 27th, 1988, Atlantic City, New Jersey. This was a fight for me that stood out because, as I've stated in the past, Tyson, I consider him my favorite fighter, though all of my Muhammad Ali memorabilia might say otherwise. But I consider him my favorite fighter, and I felt that on this particular night, he was just in such a complete, out of this world type form, and he just controlled every aspect of this event. And you could just see it from the moment that he started to walk out. I mean, the crowd was there; they were on their feet. Spinks came in, did his thing. You could see on his face that, he knew he was going to be in for potentially a long night with Mike Tyson on this particular day. And then Tyson comes in. His interest is just this dark tone, just not even any real music, just this dark tone, the heavy tone with a few chains clinging and clanging here and there. He didn't have a robe on, anything of that nature. It's just like, hey, I came here to show up for a fight, and I'm going to do my thing. And from the moment he walked out, you could just tell that this was probably going to be something special. And it only lasted 91 seconds. So when we think about great fights as far as any back and forth, this isn't quite that. But, man, the type of intensity that you could just feel in the atmosphere, man, what I would have given to have been there. And I think that for us boxing fans, of course, we love to see a great fight. But when you throw other elements into the mix, say the intangibles, just the overall charisma, the environment of a fight, this is one that certainly delivered. I guarantee that after those 91 seconds, there wasn't anyone there who felt that they didn't get their money's worth because of the fact that this was just on and another level as far as that overall aura that Tyson was presenting at this particular time. Now, Spinks was the lineal champion and the ring champion. He was the man that beat the man. Of course, he had those wins over Larry Holmes, actually being the first to defeat him. And Tyson, he came in with the WBA and WBC and IBF World Heavyweight title. So it was a highly anticipated fight. And if I'm not mistaken, I was looking at the odds, or I was looking at more so what a lot of the actual pros were saying, and a lot of them were picking Michael Spinks to actually get the victory over Tyson. They just felt he had a package that would be able to sort of solve what it is that Tyson would bring to the table, and he had, of course, the height and reach on him. But man, it was just one of those fights that when I just think about Mike Tyson and what made him an exciting fighter for me, this one I just go back to. I've had to see this thing hundreds of times because of the fact that it's so short. And then the call that you get from the gentleman's name, I can't think of it right now, but even the call just is one of the greatest calls in the sports history as well. Just when Spinks goes down, it's like, I don't think he's getting up. And he's out there. It's just one of those, the Colonel, I know is his name, Bob Sheridan. There it goes. But yeah, man, his call on the fight, I think that just added to it as well. And at that particular point, it was the richest fight in history, grossing around 70 million, 10 million more than what was the Hagler versus Leonard fight from 87. But this was just one of those where people packed in. They wanted to see it. It had a high gate as well, and closed circuit was a big hit for closed circuit as well. And it generated a ton of money. I think in the closed circuit alone, it was around 32 million is what I had gathered. But I just had to add this to the list for me because I just think that if you wanted to show someone just the intimidating nature of Mike Tyson, this fight had all of that to a T. And I think this is why even at this point, he just has such a following and people who just want to see him and be around him just because of the fact that he was able to bring this type of aura to the fight game. And he was certainly in the mold of Jack Dempsey back in the day. And I know that's what he molded himself after in some regard. So I think that added to it. In studying that, he understood what the dynamics were. and he was a student of the game, of course. So this just added to it, and I think that he had that it factor that some boxers seldom get to, but he was able to do so. And yeah, for that, I think that's why he remains one of the most popular boxers in history, just overall. So that's my number 4 there, Tyson Spinks.
Can I jump in 1 second if it's okay, BL?
Yeah, by all means, Scott.
I wanted to jump in because I wanted to let 86 know I was at that fight. That was one of the fights that I had over 500 championship fights that I actually attended, and that was one of them.
Wow.
And I can tell you,
that's amazing.
I can tell you what it was like. Mike Tyson, he was probably the only fighter in my lifetime that I went to see, and even the members of the audience, you can feel the tense, you can feel the aura of invincibility. He's just one of those human beings that are like that. So when he came, he was coming down to some chains. It was just chains. That's all that you heard. And that alone, somewhat of an awakening. So you didn't see him. Mike Tyson was very short, but you saw the mob coming. And he was coming very fast. And as you began to see him, he had on his white towel or something. And when you saw him, you got chills from the distance you were from him. You wasn't even in the ring with him. It's just that he has that aura of it. Some guys have it. Listen, you can go down to Dempsey. Mike Tyson had it. And so when he got close to you, you felt as though there was a spirit out of him that will attack you. That's why I can understand a lot of these guys were feared when they got in there with him. It's just something about his aura that actually cringed you. So when he walked into the ring, and as soon as he put one leg over in one strap and then the other one, and you can really see him at that point, everything changed. You started to sweat almost. And you can see Spinks like he wanted to walk out of the, he never wanted to go in the ring to begin with. He was delaying the affair. They had to have people go inside the locker room to get him because they heard that Mike Tyson was punching holes in the wall and everything else. So Larry Hazard, who was the commissioner at that time, had to go back there and find out what the hell is going on here. Butch Lewis, he always had his antics and everything else, RIP to him. But when they finally got that fight started, Michael Spinks' feet were in mud. He didn't really know how to even go about this. And Mike Tyson went right to him. 2 knockdowns, fight was over. And it was the most intense feeling that you could have that I've ever had since I've been attending boxing since 1974. So that was an experience of a lifetime. I hadn't seen anything since. Maybe the Hagler-Hearns fight that I attended in 85, but that was a moment in 88 at the Atlantic City Casino. It was amazing. It was amazing.
Amazing stuff, Scrapbook.
So you were at So you saw Hagler-Hearns. How loud was it?
Hagler-Hearns was one of the most amazing fights that I've actually went to because Hagler was coming out to war, the music war, and he was bouncing from side to side. I was at the aisleway when he was passing me, and it was just another amazing night. You were sweating under the armpits, and just the fact that they were in the ring after their first round, everybody was exhausted. They was exhausted with perspiration. That's how exciting that was. It's just certain things in life get your adrenaline flowing, and there's certain fights that make that happen. That's why you have to fight your legacy opponent. If you don't fight your legacy opponent, you're not, in my eyes, and I think BL can share this with me. We don't look at these guys as what they should be. That's the whole reason why you're in there. You get those guys every 10 years that come around like a Hagler, like a Tyson, these special fighters. You have to meet your legacy opponent and you'll get these results, win or lose. And I was just a pleasure of being at some of those fights.
Incredible. Okay, so now I've totally lost my way. What are we on? Your number 4 now, BL?
If I may, Random. Oh,
yeah,
sorry, buddy. If I may just add to that as well, it's also worth noting what Scrapbook mentioned about Spinks not wanting to come out of his dressing room because, as I've told this story before, Butch Lewis in his white suit, you know, they go to other fighters' dressing room. And when Butch Lewis went to Tyson's dressing room, because Butch Lewis even admitted he was aware that Tyson had a lot of pressure on him at that point. He had a lot going on with Robin Givens, and, you know, he'd lost Custamato and all kinds of crazy things, and he was still a young guy. He was still very young, early 20s. And Butch Lewis said, "Oh, you know, I'm going to put some pressure on him. I'm going to go in there and strut me stuff, and, you know, act like my guys, you know, do." And he said he goes in, he's allowed in, and he said Rooney's shouting out these numbers, and Tyson is punching the wall, and he said he's knocking plaster off. And Butch Lewis actually said, without realizing it, he realized this afterwards, he pulled his white hanky out of his jacket pocket and dabbed his forehead, thinking, "Oh no, oh no." Now, Tyson, to me, that was the culmination of everything he'd been through, from the rapid rise up through all those 27-0, 25 KOs, you know, prior to the title, cleaning out the heavyweight belts. It all culminated to me that night. And combined with all that tumultuous rise, coupled with all the personal problems, I think it just ended in one savage fighter who, to me, I think any heavyweight in history would have trouble beating Tyson that night. He was so focused on destruction and getting rid of his opponent, due to everything going on, his losses, his problems, his rise, his popularity. I just think Spinks was in the wrong ring at the wrong time. But I'd also say, I believe it were record purses at the time. Mike Tyson got $23 million, I believe,
Yes.
which equates to nearly $250,000 a second. And, you know, yes, Spinks were wiped out in brutal style, but he didn't do that badly, earning nearly $140,000 a second either. I think Spinks's purse were roughly around 13 million. But yeah, 86 Boxing,
Yes.
great choice, because one thing I'll shout out 86 Boxing for picking this fight, and one of my fights is similar. Sometimes it's not about the length of the fight, it's about the significance of the fight. And this fight, to me, as Scrapbook alluded to, was a major league fight. So great choice, 86, and great stuff, Scrapbook. You know, when you give us that there at the time experience, it's great, because, you know, we weren't there. So, you know, passing on what it was like there is fantastic. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I will go on to my second fight. And my second fight, okay, and probably some people would expect this, my second fight was at Boyle's 30 Acres in Jersey City. Okay, 1921 between Jack Dempsey and Georges Capronte. In a purpose-built stadium, okay, a purpose-built stadium that was supposed to house around 80,000 people. It cost a lot of money to be borrowed to build the arena. You know, Tex Rickard got into this thing with Dempsey because Dempsey's popularity grew so much because of his whirlwind attacking style, the way he destroyed Willard. He'd also beaten Brennan, and I think Capronte, if I remember correctly, was his third title defense. Everything could, I mean, just look at that shot there. You can see the little ring in the middle of that. That was a built stadium for that fight. We don't do that now. We have stadiums that they convert, or football stadiums that they build the ring in. This was a purpose-built arena for that fight, okay? And it grossed the first $1 million gate people throw around. It actually grossed nearly $1.8 million, which in 1921 was a huge amount of money, okay? Now, coupled to that as well, is you have the perceived war hero, Georges Capronte, against the perceived draft dodger, Jack Dempsey. So that led in the negotiations and the build-up to the fight. You know, that led to this narrative that Dempsey, the war dodger, will he get beat by the great French war hero? And Capronte was a very attractive young guy. You know, this one, if I remember it, one at first fights where large amounts of females attended, because Capronte had a very big female following, you know, following his build-up in America and the build-up to the fight. He was a dashing young Frenchman, a war hero. So, you know, he attracted a large lady audience to the fight, as I recall. And I can't remember, Scrapbook might confirm this, but I'm sure that this was the first world title fight to be broadcast live on the radio. They actually built the mass, they actually built the system to transmit this world title fight on radio for the first time. The first world title fight pronounced on radio. Yeah, thank you, Scrap, for confirming that. They actually built the system. You know, it was built by an American company, if I recall. But apparently the organisers of some organisers or owners at land were not keen on telephone lines being built in there or something. There was some, they had to do it another way. But large women attendance, the first world title fight to be broadcast on radio, the great story between the war hero, the attractive young Frenchman, and the draft dodger perceived to be Jack Dempsey. The fact that Dempsey had this ferocious whirlwind attacking style, the fact that Capronte were a big knockout puncher. In fact, one interesting fact about this fight is actually when you look at the fighters, if I recall correctly, Capronte had more knockouts than Dempsey had wins. Part of the problem was that Dempsey outweighed him by, were it 15 to 18 pounds, something, I can't remember exactly. So Capronte were outweighed and outsized, but he had more knockouts than Dempsey had wins. He was a big puncher, a big one-punch knockout puncher. And, you know, the fight itself wasn't that much of a great fight. Dempsey were hurt by a massive right hand in round 2, as I recall. Dempsey stamped his authority in round 3, and in round 4, dropped him twice, first with a left right. And then, if I remember, Dempsey, as soon as Capronte got up, Dempsey went after him. And final punch, if I remember, were a right hooked up body that just put Capronte down. So not the greatest fight of all time, but historically significant for the record gate of nearly $1.8 million. Historically significant for the first world title fight broadcast on radio. And if I recall, it was transmitted in 60 or 70 cities, something like that. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of cities where this fight were transmitted. So a huge historical fight in front of a huge crowd. That's why this is one of my 5 greatest fights in boxing history.
Wow, I just want to say one thing, if you don't mind. Oh, that was great, BL. 86 has shared with us something that brought back memories to me about this with the first radio, with the RCA. I don't know if 86, you want to bring that back up again. That was a great point you made in the last stream that we did about the RCA, the first radio call for this fight.
Oh yeah, yeah. So, yeah, the company RCA, and I didn't even know at the time that this was the case, but they were pretty much, it was the last stop for the gentleman in the picture that is showing the top right. I can't think of his name right now, but he worked with another individual that he knew that was involved with RCA at the time, and they were the ones who helped broker the rights to establish this broadcast. And I do recall that it had a 250-mile radius as far as what they were able to get. I could be off. Wow. I could be off a little bit. Maybe not 250 miles, but I remember it being 250,000. I want to say it's something. There was something, and it's escaping me now. But yeah, you're right, BL. This was like the largest radio broadcast at that particular time, and it helped to establish RCA as a real player in this whole industry of course, broadcasting, and they got into electronics just in general and all that stuff. So this was the fight. It was a huge gamble, but it paid off in a major way for everyone involved.
Thank you, 86. Thank you, BL.
Yeah, good stuff, 86. I want that shot on the RCA, if I remember it, in that Radio Corporate of America or Radio Corporation of America or something. Yeah, I've heard of them. I didn't know too much about that particular aspect, so thanks for pointing that out. But yeah, certainly a huge event historically. It's also just interesting that both of these guys, Georges Capronte at light heavyweight and then Jack Dempsey for his heavyweight title, would both go on to eventually lose to a fighter who, if I remembered, fought on the undercard, Gene Tunney, the fighting Marine. Yes. If I recall, Gene Tunney fought on the undercard, and he would go on to beat both men, Capronte, and then removing heavyweight title off Dempsey. A bit of one of those strange ones there.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, and if I can, real quick, random, I had to pull up my notes from the video I created, but yes, it just set a mark broadcasting. And another thing that I found very interesting is in 1922, the annual radio sales, they were at 60 million, and then by 1924 it was 358 million, and this fight was a major part of that actually being the case.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. Good stuff. I guess I'll start my number. Where are we at now? Number 2 for me.
Number 4, I think.
Number 4, yeah, we're going backwards. Yeah, number 4 would be December 5th, 1947, between Joe Louis and Jersey Joe Walcott. Joe Louis was a 10-1 betting favorite. The fight took place in New York's Madison Square Garden. He weighed 211 pounds, and Jersey Joe Walcott weighed 194 pounds. Joe Louis was 6'1.5", and Jersey Joe was 6 foot. He had a 74-inch reach, as Joe Louis had a 76-inch reach. The referee was Ruby Goldstein, and he wound up having the fight 6-7 in favor of Jersey Joe Walcott. And he told Joe Louis in the dressing room, "I will never referee your fight again. I need you to retire. This is a sad day in boxing." Joe Louis was getting ready to walk out of the ring before the referee had even announced or raised his hand, because he felt as though he didn't win that fight. Why I choose this fight, once again, in collaboration with the second fight that took place June 25th, 1948, was because of the significance of this particular event. It was Joe Louis's 24th fight, third fight, excuse me, in 1948. It was his 22nd fight in 1947. And what was, I may have that mixed up, but I'm not worried about that right now. The biggest thing is Joe Louis had lost that fight with Jersey Joe Walcott, and it caused a lot of problems with the British Boxing Board of Control, because Lee Savoy was supposed to get the second shot. Now, Jersey Joe Walcott had defeated Elmer Violent Ray, and that's how he got that shot in 1947 with Joe Louis. But because of the controversy, Joe Louis was almost forced to give Jersey Joe Walcott a second opportunity for this fight, so Lee Savoy didn't get his shot. When Joe Louis would defeat Jersey Joe Walcott in 1948, he wound up knocking him out. Then he would retire in 49, and that's when he appointed Jersey Joe Walcott and Eddie Charles for fighting, for his titles. But they only recognized the NBA, not the New York SAC, because the other organizations, such as the British Boxing Board of Control and the Ring, and they didn't recognize Joe Louis anymore because Lee Savoy didn't get his shot. It was a complicated situation. So in 50, Eddie Charles would wind up fighting Joe Louis in New York Yankee Stadium to solidify his heavyweight championship, universal recognition of it. And then Joe Louis would wind up beating Lee Savoy in 51, and then that's when everybody decided to recognize his Charles. It was crazy. But this particular fight in 1948, it brought 42,667 members in the audience. That was really amazing, because they wanted to find out if Joe Louis still had it. And he was dropped in both fights by Jersey Joe Walcott, but he showed a true definition of what a champion really is, who can really bite down and make a difference in a specific fight. And he would wind up banging with Jersey Joe Walcott. Walcott made the mistake by standing there flat-footed trying to bang with him, and he got caught, and he couldn't recover. Joe Louis opened up with a beautiful combination to the head, and he knocked him out. And Joe Louis would then continue his championship reign, and he would fight again in 50 and lose to Eddie Charles, and he lost all recognition, wound up retiring in 51 after he would lose to Rocky Marciano in New York's Madison Square Garden. But this fight was so significant, both fights in 47 and 48, that I believe, in my opinion, it should be recognized on this list as my top 5 greatest fights of all times. And the fights that we're choosing, it's something that's coming from us personally. There's no agenda behind it. So we don't want to see people in chats or later on writing, "Oh, why didn't they?" No, it's basically what we feel, what meant something to us. And that's the reason why we choose the fights that we do.
Yeah, well put, Scrap. Right on. Okay, so where does that bring us?
I believe to you, Random, you're number 4.
Yeah, can I just quickly jump in? Sorry. Yeah, I also want to add that Jersey Joe Walcott, in especially the first Joe Louis fight, also showed how good he is, because some people, well, in the second fight he was doing it to a large extent as well, but Walcott was a very, very excellent fighter, tricky fighter, very skilled and clever fighter and experienced. And, you know, in that first Joe Louis fight, he was giving Joe Louis fits, making him lead and hitting him with silly counters. That, you know, fantastic fighter he was.
Oh, very true, Bill.
Absolutely. And also, Walcott spent some time training under the great Jack Blackburn, who we all know is one of the most brilliant fighters of the early era, an era of with lots of brilliant fighters, but Blackburn was one of those rare people who could translate it into passing on the craft. And
Very true.
you know, what a great fighter he was. He went to jail for some years. He was a pretty hard fella. I think he was actually wasn't his brother Fred who slashed him across the face? I think Fred was a boxer too, not on his level. But anyway, Blackburn was a hard fella. He got into trouble, and so he lost years of his prime. But he came back and was still brilliant, and then he went on to be one of the greatest trainers of all time. I don't know if you guys, I don't want to stretch this out too much, but Blackburn taught Lewis all the lessons he learned from that early era, fighting all these great fighters, different stylists at a rapid pace. Blackburn knew so much, and he channeled it into Joe Louis. But he also passed it on to other powerful fighters. So Jersey Joe got some of that. Circumstances didn't allow him to spend all his time there, but you know, even sometime with a great fighter, we see nowadays people switch trainers, and you see a difference in a fight, or maybe two fights within two fights. So anytime with Jack Blackburn is a big thing. I just wanted to throw that in there. Shout out to Jack Blackburn.
Indeed.
Yeah, great fighter he was.
Oh, and I think we got to mine, right? My number. All right,
Number
so
four.
my number 4. So I already did Hagler Hearns. The order of these don't even, you know, anyway. So the almost random order. Let me find my graphic here. And again, this may come up. I'm not gonna dwell on any of my list for too long. But I have great Jack Johnson fighting Jim Jeffries in 1910 in a super duper fight. In the sense that, well, at the time it was a super fight, but Jeffries had retired undefeated. Johnson had felt ducked by Jeffries. He was, he felt ducked by all the white champs until he finally got his shot in 1908 against Tommy Burns. Tommy Burns got a huge payday. I think it was like 30 grand. He got some like basically medium-sized retirement money, and Johnson got a few thousand himself. But as soon as he had that title, he fought he fought like, I think 6 rounds against Jack O'Brien, who was a great light heavyweight, but past his best. And then he fought 6 rounds against Tony Ross, who was not at the top. He was the guy losing to the top guys. And then he fought Al Kaufman, even though he was at his the fight before, and he was laughing at him. Then he fought the middleweight champion, the great Stanley Ketchel, but it was all leading up to this. He was trying to bait Jeffries to come back so he could beat him, so he could be the absolute governor. And he wasn't fighting the contenders in the lead up to this, the top guys. Kaufman kind of was, but he wasn't proven like the guys Johnson didn't want to face. But this fight right here, Jeffries lost a lot of weight. He got back into shape. He wasn't what he once was, because what he once was a phenom. He was so nimble for a huge guy that, in the scope of how everyone was walking around, he was a giant dude for them. But Johnson, it was a huge event, especially for a lot of the black boxers, people who have been denied their own shots or had to go through extra adversity. Johnson schooled him, and then he took a couple years off. He was doing other stuff, and he was also being sort of persecuted at home. So there was a lot of things going on, but this was arguably his crowning moment. Not winning the world title from Tommy Burns, because Tommy Burns was part of that short lineage to fill the vacancy for Jeffries. So that's, I think, all I'm going to say on that fight. It was magnificent. It wasn't necessarily a competitive fight, but Johnson was an entertainer, and it was a huge fight. And they were unfortunate. There was fallout from it. There were, after the fight, because there was a lot of sort of social fragility, and people were freaking out. But it was a complicated time. I'm not going to get into all that because we only have a couple more hours. I don't want to eat up 40 minutes of it going off on the era, but this is a gigantic fight, and that's why it had to be inside my number 5. And I think that brings us back to 86. Are we at your number 3, sir?
All right. Yeah, great pick there, Random. I'm sure it'll come up again. But anyway, my number 3, And this almost, in some sense, mirrors to a degree but the previous fight. But my number 3 is Muhammad Ali versus Cleveland Williams, November 14th, 1966. Now, of course, I wasn't around to, and maybe none of us really saw Ali or all of his stuff, of course, at the time he was applying his trade. But he is a fighter that became very fond of me, especially in looking back on the history. I would hear about him and all of that stuff. I remember when I was younger, a bit younger, I remember seeing him light the Olympic torch in, I want to say that was, 96 or something like that. But I just remember seeing him, and I don't know that I understood the significance of him as a fighter at that particular time. But I felt that on this particular night, it was Muhammad Ali in his greatest form, for me at least, just the way he was able to apply his trade in the ring. And this is what essentially made me fall in love with his style and just the way that he was able to move in there so gracefully, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, as they say. And Cleveland Williams, I know a lot of casual fans today may not be familiar with him, but he was a big punching heavyweight. He was solidly built, a big guy, and he had real power for sure. And Ali, he's one of these individuals who did things the non-conventional way. So it was a matter of he was going to have his hands down, and he was going to just do what he wanted to do there in the ring, even if that left him susceptible to potentially taking a huge shot. And Cleveland Williams was the type who had the power to really change things in a second. But for Ali, at least for me in this particular moment, man, just to see him as he moved around, he was on his toes, the way he danced around, the way he just made Williams miss shots, just literally in some cases, maybe by a few centimeters, an inch at most or something like that. I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. I just fell in love with his style just from watching that. And for him to be the size that he was and able to do such, it just makes me hold him in such high regard. It was a thing of beauty, and he literally looked as though he was floating there. And he would go on to, of course, stop Williams in the third round of that fight. Realistically, if it were to happen today, it might have been stopped earlier, because the way that Ali was just rattling off his combinations, it was just it was it was unseen for me, at least at that particular time, when I was just first being able to see him. And it what showed me that, man, he was legitimately one of the greatest fighters to ever have laced him up, and especially being there in the heavyweight division, and the way he just easily just let his hands go and dropped Cleveland Williams multiple times. It just showed you how he was able to be a standout and the type of confidence that he had. And then his speed was absolutely blistering. And Cleveland Williams, he was game, and even just trying to block. It was just the rapid fire combinations that Ali was throwing out didn't allow him an opportunity to really even get off anything of significance. And you could just tell he just didn't know what to do in there once Ali started to really go off. And it was like his corner, just throwing him into the fire, because they could have certainly had stepped in well earlier than when this fight was actually stopped. And if I'm not mistaken, at the end of the second round, I believe Williams was dropped just before the bell, and I thought it was over. And there's an overhead shot, I believe, that was taken with Ali with his hands raised and Cleveland Williams straddled out. I think it's one of the most iconic pictures in boxing history. And it was just essentially Ali walking towards his corner. And I think that for me, just when I think about great fighters and then guys that I absolutely love to watch, and when someone new to the sport or something of that nature is unfamiliar with who Muhammad Ali is, or who he was as a fighter, I would say, then this is one of the fights I tell them to go watch, and why you have many people who hold him in high regards, because he was different than a lot of the other heavyweights that we have seen. Yeah, Ali wasn't the strongest, but it's just the way that he was able to just put all aspects together and do things so unconventional at that time. It just made him such a sight and a joy to see. And even in this particular point in time, just his replay value alone on his fights, it just shows you that. And this is certainly one of them. And you'd be hard pressed to find a heavyweight since who was actually able to do things in that same exact fashion that Muhammad Ali was. And it was almost like he wasn't a heavyweight. And I know he styled himself somewhat after Sugar Ray Robinson. So this was like that in a larger form. And it's just a fight that I've seen so many times. And it's one I hold in high regards just for Muhammad Ali. And he's a fighter that, man, I'll tell you, I've gotten introduced to the history over a number of years, but and there's so many great fighters, and a lot of when you start getting to that top level, some of that stuff is interchangeable in terms of so many fighters had these great standout things. You think about the great heavyweights. A lot of people put Ali there as number one. You could just as easily throw Joe Louis in there, and a lot of people have him there. Two different styles, really. But yeah, for me, it's just Muhammad Ali. This is what made me sort of a overall fan of him and view him as the top heavyweight of all time. And I think that on this particular night, he was just in a form that man, it's just beautiful to see. And for such a brutal sport, this performance was beautiful. So there you have it. My number 3, Ali versus Williams.
Fantastic. So let's see. PL,
Yeah,
number 3.
Could I just add something on there? You know, I like adding these little bits on.
Feel free.
Apologies, but yeah, great choice, 86. And the one thing I'll add to that is people now say, well, fighters are better than Muhammad Ali. Now, you show me a top 10 heavyweight now who can move and punch with as much speed and accuracy as Ali in that fight, because it's not only that he threw a lot of punches, the accuracy of his punches were frightening. The way he was using his feet to lead Williams on to shots that he would then tag him with. He was luring Williams in and then hitting him with shots. He was stood doing shuffles in between throwing 6 to 8 punch combinations. I have never seen a heavyweight performance like that in my life, not in terms of the brutalness of a Tyson Spinks, but just the output, the work rate, the sharpness of his punching, the speed of his movement. I mean, I commented earlier on Mayweather Pacquiao that Pacquiao commented after the fight, well, it would hard to throw punches because he were moving. Well, if you think Floyd Mayweather's hard to tag when he's moving, you try and tag Muhammad Ali in that fight. He's way bigger man than Mayweather, way heavier, and he's moving like a ballerina. He's bouncing around that ring like a ballerina, but there's method in the madness. He's using those defensive jabs and his rear movement and swinging around to lure Williams in. Then he's tagging him with right hands and hurting him. It were a masterful performance, and it were a great choice, 86.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I think we're on your number 3 now, BL.
Oh, my number 3. Oh, okay. So my number 3 is a fight I have not seen. Now, some people may say that's strange, but it wasn't 5 greatest or biggest fights we have seen. It's the 5 biggest or greatest fights in boxing history. And to me, when I think about the 5 greatest fights, I have to include a fight I haven't seen. And random Scrapbook will know instantly where I'm going, when I say the Circuit de Paris in Paris in April 1909, to me, housed the most brutal fight of all time in boxing history. And I'm going only on word of others. Okay, there are no footage of this fight. We only have some still images of McVeigh on the floor, Jeanette on the floor when McVeigh stood in corner with his arms over the corner ropes waiting for Jeanette to get up. A fight where you had two fighters, one of them probably one of the most powerful punchers of his entire era in Sam McVeigh. Jeanette also was a puncher, but not quite of the brutality of McVeigh. Both of these men had masses of stamina. Both of these men had masses of durability, and they both had an equal will to win. Okay. Now, the fight started out, first few rounds, Jeanette using that boxing and moving with his jab he liked to do. McVeigh, you know, trying to time him with left hooks. And then McVeigh, a bit like Barbados Walcott, he'd employ these tactics of, he'd have a few quieter rounds, then all of a sudden in a round, he'd explode and start winging shots. And trust me, if you watch footage of like even McVeigh against battling Jim Johnson, when he lets both of those hands go, we intend to hit you. I would not like to be on receiving end of that. Let me tell you right now, because he was a powerful guy, and he'd drop Jeanette, and he'd have Jeanette groggy, and Jeanette would get up, and then McVeigh would take a few rounds off. Then for 2 rounds, explode, dropping Jeanette again multiple times and winning those rounds. And this fight went on all the way through into early 20 rounds, where Jeanette were getting dropped like a spinning top. But one of the things about it is Jeanette went down over 20 times, and then when we come to like round 32 to 34. We see a remarkable turnaround, okay, where Jeanette suddenly, after being down over 20 times, starts pushing McVeigh back and hitting him and attacking him and pushing him to ropes and starting to unload punches, okay? When we get into the early 40s in terms of rounds, yes, this fight went on that long, you've got Jeanette physically pinning McVeigh to ropes and clubbing him with multiple uppercuts, hooks, everything. Okay, by round 49, after round 49, Jeanette came out and basically said, Joe, I can't see you. I can't go on. You're the better man. I mean, what a testament. They fought for 3¼ hours. They fought 49 brutal rounds with nearly 30 knockdowns in the fight in total. Some people say McVeigh did go down. Some people say McVeigh didn't go down. But one thing is certain, Jeanette went down over 20 times. Okay, and somehow, with that remarkable durability, and you know, some people called him boxing's Iron Man back in 1910s because he had this ridiculous kind of durability and stamina. Even Jack Johnson said, I'll fight him over 20 rounds. I'm not fighting him in a fight to finish because you can't hurt him. And if you do hurt him, he just gets up and keeps coming. You can't stop him. He will keep coming all night long. No matter how much you drop him, no matter how much you hit on him. So even Jack Johnson, like, paid Jeanette that respect. He's one of the most durable fighters, you know, in heavyweight history. When you couple that fight in one of the most brutal punchers, and both guys have got great chains, both guys have got great stamina and endurance, it kind of blended, okay, into, to me, a 3¼ hour war and a legendary fight. You know, Sam McVeigh later said, long after the fight, he actually said, you know, I felt like I'd just ground my hands down to powder hitting that man, and he just kept coming and kept getting up and wouldn't stop. I mean, that's a great respect. So I put the April 1909 fight between, to me, heavyweight legends Sam McVeigh and Joe Jeanette as my number 3.
That's a great choice right there, sir. So let's see, Scrapbook, I believe we've arrived at your number 3, sir.
Absolutely. First of all, BL, great story behind that fight. That was an outstanding fight. They fought 3 times that same year in 1909. Their last fight was 30 rounds. This fight went 47 rounds on April 17th of that year. And you're right. I mean, Jeanette went down 27 times. McVeigh went down 11 times, a total of 38. It was one of the greatest fights of all times. I didn't choose that fight because I anticipated that you might. So,
you know me too well, buddy. You know me too well.
Absolutely. Great job. So my number 3, I'm at 3, right? August 17th, 1938. Once again. And May 31st, 38. And the reason why I'm doing this is because the significance, once again, of what happened with this gentleman, Henry Armstrong. Now, April 31st of 38, he was in a ring with Barney Ross. He weighed 132¼ pounds. You'll get different weights based on the records you read. And then Ross weighed about 144 pounds. Henry Armstrong was 5'5.5" with a 67-inch reach. Barney Ross was 5'7" with a 67-inch reach. They were fighting for the New York sack and the NBA, as well as the ring belt. And what was significant about this was that Henry Armstrong would wind up becoming the 4th Black welterweight champion in boxing history. He was a dynamic fighter. He already had the featherweight championship belt. He was the first Black American featherweight champion in boxing history in 1937 when he took on Petey Cerrone. And he had 27 fights with no losses or 26 knockouts that same year. And he defeated Petey Cerrone in the first fight that Mike Jacobs would take over in the New York Madison Square Garden. He was the first championship fight and card that Mike Jacobs would have. That's how significant it was. And he was also the 3rd Black fighter to win a championship belt in Madison Square Garden in boxing history. It has never been done. Tiger Flowers when he defeated Harry Greb, and you had John Henry Lewis when he defeated Bob Olin in 1935. Henry Armstrong would then do that in 37. Well, in 38, he would defeat Barney Ross at the New York Madison Square Garden Bowl. What was a jinx about that arena, no champion ever defended their titles in that arena. Never happened. And when Henry Armstrong defeated Barney Ross, oh my God, unbelievable. He somewhat carried Barney Ross. They both had the same manager. And it was a historic time. It really was. It really was. So then he becomes the lightweight champion August 17th of 1938 when he defeated Lou Ambers. And what was significant about that situation is because he now held all 3 belts simultaneously. And that has never happened in any weight division, other than, Bob Fitzsimmons, but he didn't have them all at the same time. Henry Armstrong did. So that was very significant. And for me, that changed the script in boxing as what can be done from one fighter. And remember, Henry Armstrong had a lot of challenges coming up during his time. So that was my 3rd greatest fight in boxing history. Henry Armstrong, Lou Ambers, and you can also say Barney Ross.
Yeah, well said, Scrap, well said. And I'd also like to add that to people out there, Scrapbook alluded to it there, Henry Armstrong didn't go featherweight, lightweight, welterweight. Henry Armstrong went featherweight to welterweight, okay? Absolutely. Pay attention to these fighters now who haggle over a 2 or 3 pound weight hydration or advantage. He went from featherweight champion to welterweight champion. Then he went and won, like Scrapbook said, against the Hermika Hurricane, a super tough former lightweight champion. So, that's another historical thing there. He didn't go up through the weights. He leapfrogged weights to get that welterweight title against a 3-weight champion from time who were one of the best fighters in the world at that time. It ended up being Barney Ross's last fight. But Barney Ross was a super tough fighter, make no mistake. So jumping from feather and capturing that welterweight title against one of the greatest fighters of that period, that just shows what a great accomplishment it was of Armstrong's, like Scrap alluded to.
Yeah, good shout, fellas. Hey, and so is it fair to say, so how many classes were there? Was it 8-weight classes in Armstrong's day?
Yes.
So he had 3/8 of the gold.
That is correct.
He had 3/8.
Yeah, because Super Bantam and Super Feather, they went on hiatus at that point, and Light Welter, they went on hiatus at that point, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so he had 3/8. So when we talk about pound for pound, this is a top echelon, all-time great. He had 3/8 of the sport simultaneously. He was the man for 3/8 of the brackets. That's
amazing. You'll never see that again.
No.
Yeah, that's like some Alexander the Great conquering the Persian Empire type thing. Like took a huge chunk, like an empire. I think it was like 50 times the size of his own. That's like Armstrong just took over. What a great fighter. We should do a show on him. Maybe some of these panels sometimes we can just focus on a fighter, just talk about one guy. He'd be a guy to talk about.
Oh, and that's why I think BL and I have him number 1 as welterweight, because he defended his title as welterweight 19 times after after coming up from featherweight and then going down to lightweight, and then he swallowed his blood. He had to swallow for the last 5 rounds in Lou Amber's fight his own blood. Imagine how much you talk about dehydration, and then he would turn around and defend that welterweight championship 19 times. And I mean, what else can I say about Henry Armstrong? Phenomenal.
Yeah, I'll add to that what Scrapbook mentioned. That slice on Armstrong in second Amber's fight. Armstrong actually also said he felt like he wanted to physically vomit with the amount of blood going in his stomach, and he still kept fighting. But both of those guys, Armstrong had better stamina and punch output than Amber's, but Amber's was one tough dude. And he'd stand there and fight you all night long. I mean, aside from Lou Jenkins, who were a really big puncher, if he'd have took his career more serious, he'd have been even greater than he was already. But he could noticeably hit Lou Amber's, but many fighters couldn't even hurt this guy. You know, this shows how tough he was. But, you know, also, like Scrapbook mentioned, jumping from feather to welter down to lightweight, it's also worth noting that Armstrong turned pro below featherweight. So that makes it an even more incredible accomplishment. You know, everyone now praises Pacquiao going from flyweight to heavyweight, but Armstrong coming from, you know, a weight below featherweight, he doesn't get that same credit, and he should do. You know, he should do it for coming below featherweight. Armstrong actually blended into a featherweight and then jumped up. You know, so he fought at weights even below featherweight. So, yeah, great choice.
Absolutely. So where's that brought us to? Is it me again?
You're number 3, buddy.
Oh man, these are creeping up on me. Okay, so where's my list? All right, so when we get to this, these could be in any order, just to mention that again. I think this one already came up. Let me double check myself here. My number 3, yeah. So I'm going to go with Jack Dempsey and George Capronte for multiple reasons. It was a huge fight. It wasn't. I mean, they're both great fighters, and it was an explosive time in this for the sport, you know, and the popularity, which was already very popular, but this kind of stepped it up even further into the mainstream. And even though the fight wasn't as competitive as other matchups could have been, it was an enormous fight structurally. And just, if you're talking about great events, because, you know, I didn't even have a criteria with myself. We didn't set one collectively, but I didn't even try to set one. And this is definitely a fight I wanted to make sure I gave a shout to. But it already, I think Josh brought it up, 86 brought it up for his, so we already went through it, but I just wanted to give that a shout. This was an enormous fight. And there's sort of the post-war themes, the war hero and the perceived dodger, and the, you know, the American versus the French guy, and all this sort of international tension surrounding this fight, and the fact that it was so big and such a gigantic crowd for the time. I mean, think about boxing or mixed martial arts, kickboxing today. Do they get 80,000 people in there? It's rare. It's still rare all these years later. So I definitely want to mention that. That's all I'm going to say, though. That is my number 3. That brings us 86. We're your number 2, sir. We're getting down to it.
Thanks, Random. Yeah, my number 2, and I was going back and forth with this for a while, but it just so happens to be a fight that you already brought up, Random, and that is Jack Johnson versus James J. Jeffries, July 4th, 1910, Reno, Nevada. And this is one of those fights that just had a significance from an overall standpoint, especially for fighters of color at that particular time. The stakes were very high. It was a very polarizing time, and of course, Jack Johnson had been champion, and the term "Great White Hope" was coined in part because there was a search to find someone to dethrone Jack Johnson, because he was able to dominate at the time while he held the title. And who better to match him up against than the guy who was previously the champion, James J. Jeffries, who had retired undefeated in 1904. And actually, for an individual with just over 20 fights, he had a pretty solid set of competition that he had faced. But of course, he didn't have a ton of fights, and therefore he when we mention some of the great heavyweights, he gets brought up and everything, but usually we see guys now who, and especially during that time, who had longer careers or bigger careers as far as the amounts of fights they actually fought in that particular time. But Jeffrey was able to do a lot given that short amount, much like Jim Corbett as well. But anyway, this fight, it was a huge fight for the time, and I think that it was, of course, going to be a tough task for Jeffries just overall, given that he had been out of the ring for nearly 6 years. And if you just think about that, anyone in any trade, if you move away or stop doing it for that long, then, of course, it's going to be tough to just jump right back in and expect to be where you were when you last had actually gone through that process. So, that aside, the public, majority of the white public at least, was still backing him to defeat Jack Johnson, and they felt that he would be the right guy, and he was the only person that was out there at that particular moment that could dethrone him. And well, we know that there were some other heavyweights that were out there, but he was the one that was viewed as being the white champion that could take back the belt and actually restore the order in some sense. And now the fight in itself wasn't very entertaining. It was one of those fights that was long and drug out a good while. But I think that's in part too, because as we mentioned, when one fighter has been out for so long and he's trying to jump in with the guy in his prime and at the top of his game, and then of course you're going to run into some issues where there's probably not going to be sustained action or anything of that nature. But they got a decent amount of people that actually turned out to check out the fight. And amazingly, we still have video of the fight to this day. And there's no question that when you think about it from an overall significance standpoint, this is definitely one that you have to mention in the history of the sport because the stakes were at some of these were some of the highest stakes that the sport has seen. And for those that are fans of the history, then you know what the result ended up being. So Jack Johnson ended up stopping Jeffries, and this happened in the 15th round. And at that particular time, it was you never knew what would happen, especially it being a situation like this where Jeffries, the previous undefeated champion, and Johnson, who was this guy that a lot of the public didn't generally like, knocking out who was viewed as this hope or the great white champion to be able to take him out, but he wasn't able to do so. So this sparked a lot of violence in the aftermath of the fight. And this is happening in multiple cities, just given the polarizing effect of it. And it even led to prize fight films being banned across state lines, or at least taking them across state lines or something of that nature from 1912 to 1940. So this was significant in the history, not just because of the fight in itself, but I think even more so for what was happening outside of the ring. And it also showed that Johnson and he was in a sense kind of representing the black race to a degree, and it showed that he was not inferior to this great champion of the past, who was this white champion in Jeffries. And this kind of showed that it was meant to be as far as black fighters being able to get these title shots and being able to compete with the best white heavyweights at the time. And it had long been taboo for a black fighter to get a shot at the heavyweight title, though they had competed and gotten title shots in some of the lower weights. But prior to Johnson traveling around and finally getting a shot with the Tommy Burns, who was a Canadian there in Australia, it was sort of taboo and the color line had been drawn. But this showed that, hey, this playing field is even game for any man, regardless of color, race, creed, or anything of that nature. When two fighters step in the ring, you're two fighters, and you never know what's going to happen. I think that had Jeffries won, the prize fight bans, all that stuff, maybe the riots and things of that nature, that probably wouldn't have happened. But it was just given the magnitude of that fight and the true belief and backing that some of the fans had in Jeffries, it forced that. And once Jack Johnson actually won, and I think, of course, this played a part in history as a whole, because when Johnson eventually lost to Jess Willard, it would be a long period of time, not until Joe Louis, before a black fighter got that or was able to pick up the world heavyweight title again. And Louis was a very different personality than Johnson, who was a lot bolder, flashier, and he thrived off of being in a crowd where he was oftentimes one of the few black individuals that was there in the entire area, arena, or stadium, or wherever they may be. So he thrived off of that, and he was able to do so in polarizing times. And I think this fight, it's one of the significant fights in history because of the fact that I just feel that it was sort of it sort of let the veil down in some sense as far as the equality of these fighters in the ring, just regardless of where they were from or where they or what they look like, anything of that nature. And once we finally got past that some years down, then of course we all see how fighters have been able to generally reap the benefits of such here to where we are today, where at least at the highest levels of the sport, they're able to generate the level of funding that has been unseen in some regards, except for some of the larger fighter personalities or in champions of the past who had significant backing. But Random already mentioned this fight as well. He had it on this list, but I had to put it here at my number 2, just given the significance of it. And it's certainly a fight that is worth checking out for those that haven't, just to get familiar with the story in itself. And it's hard to sum it up in these few minutes that I've spoken, but just the general significance of it in history is high up there on the echelon in terms of those great fights. And it's not necessarily because of the action that's mentioned, but just because of what it meant at that particular time. So my number 2, Jack Johnson, James Jeffries, 1910 in Reno, Nevada.
Fantastic. Hey, real quick, if I can just say, Scrapbook, if you can hear me, I'm having trouble. It looks like I'm not sure if you're connected or if you lost your connection. If that's the case, just back out of the browser, refresh your browser and come back into the studio. I'm having trouble adding you to the stream, unless I'm seeing things wrong. But that will bring us over to BL, your number 2.
Yes,
before
I mention my number 2, I'll just say, great talk there, 86, on that historical fight. I actually considered including it in my 5 as well. It didn't get in, but I was going to include it. A historically significant fight. I always, just to add one little fun story about that fight, is in the build-up. Johnson famously had to lose a lot of weight. Okay, Jeffries had to lose a lot of weight. But he had a lot of fighters in his training camp. And one of them was the rather blunt and to the point Stanley Ketchel, who was famous for his sharp, quick put-downs. And Stanley Ketchel was actually in Johnson's training camp to try and speed him up, present him a quick opponent to spar with, to try and, get Jeffries moving. And Stanley Ketchel got bored and actually climbed out at ring this at one time and said, right, I'm leaving. And someone said, oh, why are you leaving Jeffries' training camp? And Ketchel just said quickly, this guy ain't got a chance. Johnson's going to lick him. And he left, just like that. You know, so that was Stanley Kitchell's view on what were going to happen in the fight. So yeah. But yeah, I also love the still images before the fight, because in the ring, Johnson's got that, you know, walking cane. He's got that fantastic white suit. But also there's another heavyweight in ring with him, also wearing a matching white suit, the great puncher Sam McVeigh. If you look at pictures before the fight, there's a number of fighters in there with Johnson, and one of them in a white suit is Sam McVeigh. He's also in the ring. It's just a shame he could never get a chance at Johnson for the title. But okay, meanwhile, I will go on to my number 2. Yeah, Ketchel were famous for his quick put downs. So my number 2, okay, is actually the rematch, okay, a long sort of rematch, okay, and a vital rematch at that time, okay, 1938, June 22nd, okay, just over a year before the outbreak of the Second World War. And this rematch, okay, was between the Brown Bomber Joe Louis and Max Schmeling. Some history of this fight, they had fought before. Joe Louis were 24-0, I think, were 21 or 22 KOs. Unbeaten, rapidly rising prospect, blowing everybody out. And Schmeling, okay, told, you know, in legend stories by Jack Johnson, how Joe Louis would jab, and as he pulled his left hand back, he'd drop it, leaving himself wide open for counter right hands. Now, Schmeling in the first fight, if you watch that, Schmeling catches him with right hand after right hand after right hand. Schmeling hurt Joe Louis a number of times, dropped him a number of times. And I always remember last knockdown when Louis finally goes down, and both his hands are hanging on, I think, the bottom rope or the next to bottom rope, and then he lets go of rope and just slumps. He's done. That was Joe Louis's only defeat, and after that fight, Joe Louis would actually go on to be unbeaten since. So basically, we had a situation where then Schmeling were trying to get a fight, if I recall, with James J. Braddock, but there were a number of reasons that fight didn't come off. One of them was that they didn't want the title disappearing back to Germany. Hitler and the Nazi Party jumped on Schmeling after he beat Joe Louis. You know, his wife got telegrams from Adolf Hitler himself. And, you know, when he came for a rematch, if I remember, Schmeling actually had a Nazi publicist with him. They wanted to milk this fight for every inch they could get, because when Schmeling beat Louis, they could use it as propaganda to highlight how the white German fighter was superior to the black American fighter. Okay. And Schmeling, even though he was proud to be a German, he was not proud to be a Nazi. And I think Schmeling was badly cast in many ways. He was very nationalistic. He was proud of his heritage, but he didn't really want to be associated with Nazi propaganda. Now, Joe Louis, in build-up to this fight, women were stopped. Training was deadly serious. Joe Louis actually met, was it Roosevelt he met? He met someone, and they said, Joe, we're counting on you. We need you to win this fight. And Joe Louis came out and actually spoke to people saying, my God, the whole world's depending on me to win this fight. As the fight got closer, he also famously remarked, I am fearful for this fight, fearful that I might actually kill Schmeling. Okay, that is how focused and serious Joe Louis was. Now, this also, a lot of people may not know, was also a $1 million+ gate fight. Okay, the attendance were over 70,000, I think, 72,000, 71,000 or something. But it was also another $1 million gate fight, and also well over 100 million people listened to this fight around the world. This was a major fight, and also it was against the fighter that Joe Louis had suffered his only career loss to. He'd since defeated James J. Braddock and made a number of defenses, and now it was time to face his old enemy. Now, amongst all the political and racial overtones of the fight, okay, perpetrated by the Nazis and the propaganda, like, you know, Goebbels and everyone else, was the fact it was Joe Louis's only defeat, and he did not want to lose the heavyweight title. There was media pressure on him. You have to win this at any cost. You cannot allow that title to go to Germany. Okay, everyone knew which way Germany were going by that point. You know, Hitler had been consolidating power through 1930s. Since he became chancellor in 1933, then we had Night of Broken Glass, and we had all, you know, all the groups in Germany being victimized. So Louis really had a lot of pressure on him. He took it deadly serious. The fight itself were over in just over 2 minutes. Joe Louis threw around 40 punches or something. He only missed 10 of them. You know, Schmeling was put in hospital after this fight for a number of days. And hadn't he damaged his spine or broke bones in his spine and damaged his ribs and everything else? And you actually see that shot that does that. Because in early exchanges, Louis comes out and he's focused. Every slight move Schmeling makes, Louis reacts. He's so focused like a machine on destroying Matt Schmeling at any cost. And when he gets Schmeling to ropes and lets his hands go, at one point you see him throw like a 4-punch combination that kind of hurts Schmeling. And then you see Lewis hit him with a right hook to the body behind Schmeling's left elbow. And you see Schmeling cower and bend. That was the shot that actually damaged his spine, and he's rumored to have broken 2 ribs as well. And, you know, following that, Lewis puts him down 3 times in about 40 seconds. It is one of the most complete destructions of a now Hall of Fame fighter that I have ever seen. Joe Louis responded to the pressure and the build-up and the hype around Schmeling and his fake Nazi background, and all the pressure on Joe Louis from people all over the world willing him to win. You actually had famous, like, you know, people from black communities, you know, putting pressure on Joe Louis, saying, you know, you fought hard to get where you are, world heavyweight champion. If you lose this fight, we may go back to lynchings. People are going to use you losing as an excuse to show that they are superior to us. And all this maelstrom was going on before the fight. And Lewis went in that ring and, like a absolutely focused, acute professional, destroyed Schmeling in over 2 minutes in one of the most brutal demolitions I've seen. The punches were hard, accurate, pinpoint. Schmeling did nothing in the fight. He landed maybe 1 or 2 punches. Lewis destroyed him, badly hurt him, left him in hospital. He became, you know, a darling all over the world. You know, the amount of rapture and applause Joe Louis got for that destruction of Schmeling under circumstances was immense. And, you know, I think it was not a long time after that fight that famous phrase got coined. Joe Louis is a credit to his race, the human race, okay? Kind of signifying that he'd been given the respect by some, that he was no longer seen as a black fighter. He was seen as a great fighter, regardless. Okay, some people still held his background against him, but others started to accept him at that point, you know, based on that fight due to furore. It, to me, is one of boxing's legendary fights, and a bit like 86's pick earlier with Tyson Spinks, that destructive performance. Lewis put on a destructive performance, the likes of which I have rarely seen in boxing in all my time. But yeah, Lewis Schmeling 2 is my number 2.
Oh, great job, BL. Amazing, amazing breakdown of that magnificent fight.
Thank you, Scrapbook.
Yeah, 100% agree. I thought this fight might be on the list at some point. And I agree 100% in this one that I often go back and watch as well. And I think it is a significant fight in the history of the sport in itself. And if someone is being introduced to it, this also is one that you can take them back to, and just the magnitude of it, just overall. Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah, the poise and precision and focus of Joe Louis in that fight is scary. I know that famous quote from Joe Louis, I'm fearful for this fight. And then he said, fearful that I may kill Schmeling. But the look on his face, the focus in his eyes are like lasers. I mean, I have rarely seen a fighter so focused, accurate, the timing, the power, everything blended into those destructive 2 minutes. It was awesome.
Looks like Brenda may have dropped.
No, I'm still here.
Okay.
I think we're down to Scrapbook's number 2. Yeah. My goodness.
Okay, my number 2. I was at this fight, and that's why it's so special to me. And this fighter is no longer with us. And I can only imagine what would have happened had he still been around to show us some great fights. But this gentleman, name is Salvador Sanchez, August 21st, 1981. It was between Salvador Sanchez and Wilfredo Gomez. It was in Las Vegas. I was in the second row of this particular fight that evening. And what was so special about it, I was sitting right behind Larry Holmes. What was so special about it was the bands, the battle of the bands. I will never in my life forget that moment You talk about chills. That was probably one of the most chilling nights that I had the experience in boxing. And the fight hadn't even started yet. It was the mariachi bands, and it was a beautiful salsa band that came out, and they were battling each other, and it was so beautiful. But then when the fight started, it was action from the beginning to the end. And Gomez, who was an undefeated fighter, Salvador Sanchez, came up and he showed him why he was such a great boxer. Gomez tried to move up to the featherweight division, and Gomez his hands were just too fast for Sanchez at some moments, but Sanchez punched too hard. And Gomez was one of the hardest punchers in those lower divisions, but Salvador Sanchez could really punch because he threw accurate punches. He snapped his punches. He threw punches that you couldn't see. And that's what eventually would get Gomez out of there. But it was such a beautiful evening. You know, by the time I got back to the hotel, I was shaking the whole time going back. It was a beautiful experience for me. And that same year, I went back to Vegas and I saw Hearns and Sugar Ray Leonard. So I had two great fights I saw that year in Vegas, but it was a great moment for me. So number 2 was Salvador Sanchez and Wilfredo Gomez. What a fight that was.
Yeah, I'd like to throw in there as well that another good little historical thing around that fight is Gomez was an unbeaten super bantamweight champion, and he made 18 straight knockouts in super bantamweight title fights. The only fighter to blemish him in that incredible knockout run at super bantamweight was when he jumped up and fought Salvador Sanchez. I always remember one take when Sanchez lured Gomez to ropes and he fell for it, and Sanchez caught him with a counter right hand on ropes and knocked him down.
Yes.
Sanchez was a fantastic fighter.
Absolutely right, BL. You hit that right on the head. That's exactly what happened. Amazing. Place went wild. The place went crazy. Oh my God, the place went nuts. It was unbelievable.
It's that great Mexico versus Puerto Rican rivalry. Both countries produced so many great fighters, but it was that great rivalry, wasn't it?
Oh, unbelievable. That was my number 2.
Oh, fantastic. Sorry, I don't have a graphic. I was trying to download one and upload it to the to the thing. Yeah, fantastic shout, Scrap. So for my number, let me pull up my little graphic here. For my number 2, it already got brought up, so I don't have to. The heavy lifting has been done for me. Let me just. It is the rematch between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling for all the reasons that have already been gone over beautifully. It was an important fight for one of the, if not the, all-time great heavyweights, and avenging a loss, and with so much at stake geopolitically, it's just, they're just levels, but also just a brilliant performance, a vicious performance. You know, like with Tyson Spinks, where you say that night, I don't know if anyone could have beaten Tyson, but I mean, yeah, well, the night Joe Louis avenged that loss against Schmeling, you know, does the Tyson that beat Spinks beat the Joe Louis that destroyed Max Schmeling? I don't know. That would be quite a matchup.
I believe he would have done, yeah. I believe he would have done.
Because Louis could, you know, he could go, and he had a style where he wasn't that easy to tag, you know. He didn't cover ground the way other people say, like other greats like Ali covered ground, but Joe Louis was a tank, and he came in, and he had a Scrapbook, you've done a great long video, I remember. It was probably 30 minutes on just the style of how Joe Louis's style was crafted to, you know, to be offensive and defensive and always be on balance and all this stuff. I've got to dig up that video. You have so many hundreds of videos, I have trouble sometimes finding them, but I do go on little tours going back, listening to them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm actually going to talk about Joe Louis in a moment, so I'll probably get to a little bit of that.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, so that was my number 2 fight. But like I said, my top 5 and a bunch of others that I didn't even get to, there's so many great fights. I'm still learning so much. So I just gave some shout outs. That's all my list should be taken as. But this is definitely an important fight structurally, politically, but also just within the sporting architecture. This is Joe Louis. This guy was taught all the good lessons from the old school experiences his great mentor Jack Blackburn had, and then So once again, shout out to Jack Blackburn. And the idea that things always get better was like when the boxing world lost a trainer like Jack Blackburn, you don't get another. Just like it's like Jimi Hendrix, you don't wait around for the next Jimi Hendrix. There's only one. Just enjoy them while they're there. So, and that's why boxers today aren't art. It's not actually a science. It's more of a craft, and the tools to hone in your craft don't survive in equal measure across the generations. There's no coach today who has the fight experience of Jack Blackburn. Like how many rounds have they spent fighting all-time greats and great stylists of a busy era? So yeah, Joe Louis. But so shout out to Jack Blackburn once again, but also shout out to Joe Louis for just being so dominant, being a heavyweight who is considered one of the, if not the best fighter in the sport as a heavyweight, which is something to keep in mind when people say you can't put heavyweights on the pound for pound list. Well, those discussions in it, when way more people were focusing more intently on the sport, he was on there, as was Jack Johnson and Sam Langford in these discussions as the best fighters, not just at heavyweight, but in the sport, in the whole sport. So I don't get involved in the arguments about pound for pound today. I'm far too casual, but all time for a heavyweight, Joe Louis, what a phenomenal guy. And this was a statement win on so many levels that resonated internationally in a way that most fights just never even approach. So that gets us down, if I'm not mistaken, that gets us down to our number one selections. 86, you're up, my friend.
Thanks, Random. Yeah, great choice. And of course, there's no wrong way to go with any of these. But for my number one, is one of the most brutal beatdowns in boxing history. That's Jack Dempsey versus Jess Willard, July 4th, 1919, Toledo, Ohio. Now, as mentioned, this is one of the most brutal fights. When I think about the history of the sport and my introduction to such, it was just something about seeing this fight that made me hearken back to those times and want to look even deeper into the sport just to gain an understanding of the sport in itself and the fighters that had been involved, which is why I lean towards trying to learn the history of it, because this was one of those fights that we are fortunate enough to have on film. And if you think about some of the greatest, I guess you could just say, brutal beatings captured on film, this is without a doubt one of them, and probably one of the more significant ones, because in the aftermath of such, it allowed Jack Dempsey to blossom as a megastar across the sport, unseen until we got to some of the guys that you become more familiarized with, like Tyson, etc. Of course, Ali and all of that. But at that particular time, this helped to elevate Jack Dempsey into probably one of the most famous individuals in the world, just in general. And it was just the nature of who he was, the brutality, the story to back it in terms of his upbringing, and him essentially having to scrap his way to get a meal, and going from train to train. He was a hobo at one point, and he was a true fighter in that sense, and that's where he applied his trade. That's how he made his money, from fighting. And this was his opportunity, and a big opportunity it was. And if I'm not mistaken, this might have been one of those situations where stadium was built for the fight. Can't remember fully, but it might have been the case. But this fight it's just a thing of beauty and brutality to just witness on film. And it has lived on in the annals of history. Mike Tyson, he had an interview, probably one of his more famous interviews, and when he's talking about Lennox Lewis, and he said he's Sonny Liston, he's Jack Dempsey, he's cut from that cloth. It was a cloth of brutality. And Tyson, being a history of the sport, he was very well familiar with this particular fight. And it's one-sided, much like some of the other fights that I've mentioned here today. But it's one-sided, but just the significance of it. This was the modern-day David versus Goliath, because you had this guy Dempsey about 6'1", may have been around 185, 88 pounds, somewhere in that range at this particular time for this fight. And he had Jess Willard, who was 6'6". He was this big guy, big, strong, and he had endurance and all that stuff. A super tough guy. And he was probably in the neighborhood of 240, somewhere around there at that particular time. So, in a sense, it was this David versus Goliath matchup that these individuals were being able to witness. And Dempsey came out, just the aura around him, and sort of how Tyson had that aura and others have had that aura. Dempsey, he was one of those fighters that had this same type of aura, and he had this no fear attitude there in the ring. And he, of course, he had the edge skill wise on Willard, but when you have individuals who are big and stronger than one particular fighter, you never know how a fight can change on a whim. But Dempsey didn't allow for that to happen, and when he got his opportunity, I want to say it was a four punch combination that was capped by this huge left hook that sent Willard down. And it's of significance because at that particular time, you didn't have to go to a neutral corner. So having to go to a neutral corner and the precautions that are taken today could have altered things somewhat. You never know. But at this particular time, that was not the case. So as soon as Willard was getting up, he was being pounced on, and it simply demolished there again. And it was just brutal. He ended up being dropped 7 times in that first round, if I'm not mistaken. And it just looked like the fight had been taken out of him. It wouldn't have gone that long today, without a doubt, just given the sheer brutality of it. And Dempsey, I mean, this was a star-making performance for him. We all know the story. There was like $10,000 bet, I believe, that Doc Kearns had on the line, or something of that nature, and it ended up being the case where Dempsey, he was really trying to get him out of there in the first round, and it looked like that was the case. By the time the round ended, Willard was sitting on his butt. He looked defeated. But the fight, of course, went on, and Dempsey actually had hopped out of the ring thinking it was over. I think a lot of people were thinking it was over, and the atmosphere there had to have been pretty loud, and it was outside and everything. But the fight ended up commencing on, and then from there, it was pretty much still just a no contest, and it showed that Willard was indeed a tough individual, because if you look at reporting after the fight and some of the stuff that we have out there now, of course, he took a ton of damage. Had some teeth knocked out. I want to say he might have had some broken ribs, bloody, lacerated, and he was able to withstand that for 3 rounds essentially. But he was never in the fight, and it was probably the right call, stopping the fight, or his corner handing in a towel. It probably should have been done earlier, really. But this was just a significant time because Willard, as a champion, he wasn't a very skilled fighter. He wasn't a very popular fighter in that same regard as well. And he hadn't fought very often since winning the title. I want to say this was his second defense. He had only had one defense in 1916, and this was 1919 at this particular time. And Dempsey, he just ushered in a pretty much all offense style that took the world by storm at that particular time. Baseball was rising. You had Babe Ruth out there. Of course, he was a great offensive hitter in the sport of baseball, and Dempsey was that caliber in the sport of boxing. And those two, and then I know there's another, I want to say is probably an early football player who's mentioned, Red Grange or something like that, who's mentioned as well as being one of the popular athletes of that particular time. But man, it just took Dempsey to an entirely new level, and some of his fights after that delivered in that same regard. We've already talked about the $1 Million Gate fight. Of course, we know about the Tunney fights. He fought Luis Angel Firpo. That was an exciting fight, definitely one worth watching. A lot of back and forth, a lot of knockdowns in that fight. But Dempsey, I think he just came at the prime time for when the public was in need of someone who was going to bring a truly offensive, just eye-opening, fight anticipating style to the table. And I think that recipe has allowed for some others over the course of the history to thrive off of that. So you have a good mixture in the sport, but Dempsey was certainly one of the ones to help usher that in. And of course, this was coming off the heels of others before him of varying styles. Sullivan was one considered the first champion. He was an offensive fighter as well. So Dempsey just took it to an entirely new level, and I think that this helped him to become one of those lasting names in history. When you think about the great heavyweights of the past, his reign wasn't one. I would say there's certainly several other heavyweights out there who've had reigns that have stacked up better than what Dempsey's was. But at that particular time, just what he was able to do and the money he was able to generate and his style, it just made him one of the most popular fighters ever. So when you think about heavyweights of the past, of course, his name is most certainly going to be mentioned. And I think that's a testament to him being able to do what he was able to do at that particular time. And for that, I think that Dempsey's name will certainly live on forever. And that knockout and beatdown over Willard will forever be one of those fights that people look back to, no matter how far in the history we move into from this point forward. But Jack Dempsey, Jess Willard, my number one fight, and certainly one that sticks out in my mind anytime I just think about boxing and its history in general.
Great shout out, 86. So we're down. BL, we've arrived at your number one, sir. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's a great choice, 86. And Paul Willard with his broken eye socket, broken cheekbone, 3 broken ribs, certainly had a lot of mending to do after that fight. And that's one of those fights I'd like to throw in this silly adage we have now where size is all, length of arms is all, is nonsense. It depends on who the fighters are. It depends who the big fighter is, and it depends who the little fighter is. A great little one can beat a good big one. This is why I always tell people, don't go on the size alone or the weight. Dempsey was outweighed by around 60 pounds. He was outsized by inches in height, massive inches in reach, and yet he pulverized Willard. Great choice there. So that were actually 86 and everyone. That was one of the fights I were watching footage of in the early 80s when I first became a boxing fan, and I was just awestruck by that demolition. I'd never seen anything like it, not even in the first fight I saw, which was Leonard Duran won. So my number one, okay, is the Rumble in the Jungle. I had to pick the Rumble in the Jungle for a number of reasons. Point one, okay, Muhammad Ali, the legendary heavyweight champion that he is, had seen partially better days, as he said. What bothers me now is this little belly I've got. He had like 2-inch belly. He could grab him between his fingers. He said when he was younger, he could get rid of it, but now he couldn't, showing a sign of his age. And after tough fights with Frazier, what he'd lost, the fantastic battle, the fight of the century in 71 with Frazier, the Norton loss as well, where he had his jaw broken. And then Foreman going through Frazier and Norton like they were butter and he were a hot knife, demolishing those two fighters in brutal fashion. It kind of set up this scenario where the unbeaten Foreman, who, if I remember correctly, were 40-0 with 37 KOs, and I think 25 of those KOs from 37 were inside 3 rounds or less, against an aging Muhammad Ali who had been beaten by Norton, who Foreman destroyed. He'd been beaten by Frazier. Yes, he also beat Frazier in that NABF heavyweight title fight. But Foreman destroyed people who beat Ali. And this is another vital lesson on triangle theories do not work, okay? Which is why us who study boxing history, we realize some of this stuff doesn't go as some people think it does. But basically, Ali to many people, was not going to survive the fight. Some people even didn't want the fight made because Ali was still, at that point, he was becoming more and more loved than he was in the 60s, where he was known as Gaseous Cassius, and he was always blabbing at the mouth and showing up at Liston's house with Bullhorns on the damn bus, shouting on Bullhorn at Liston's house, "Come out, you big ugly bear," all this stuff, you know, and taunting people like Patterson showing up at his gym, calling him the rabbit. He had a fruit basket with carrots and lettuce and everything in, you know. So Ali by this time were becoming more loved and respected due to wars he'd had, the great battles he'd fought, the change in the Vietnam War, which kind of made him a bit of a community hero, all the work he did with the college. So everything led up to this for him, okay? And this finally was his chance to get the world heavyweight title back, but it was against an unbeaten Olympic gold medalist who had wiped out 37 out of his 40 wins. Now, I always remember Ali's quote before the fight. You know, he did an interview before the fight. I saw that interview years ago, way back in day, and it always stuck with me. He said something like, if I can remember correctly, I'll try and recite it. He said, "My weight today is 213 pounds. That's fighting weight." He talks about how he's ready, and then he's saying, "The man is slower. The man is flat-footed. The man don't stand a chance. The stage has been set." He said, "This man's supposed to annihilate me." And then Ali said at the end of it, to coin it off, he said, "I think it'd be fitting that I go out of boxing just like I came in, beating the big, bad, ugly monster that nobody could beat." And he was absolutely motivated. After Foreman destroyed Norton, Ali jumped up at ringside and he's like, "Yeah, if this guy, you know, this guy depends on getting his man in the first 1 or 2 rounds. If he can't do that, he's frustrated. Tie him up and box him, hit him with a jab and move, frustrate him, and you retire George Foreman." You know, and he was convinced he were going to win. And some people thought he was delusional. Some people thought, yeah, he's, Muhammad Ali's doing what he always does. He's talking the big game, but Foreman is going to go through him, you know, like a knife through hot butter. He's going to demolish Muhammad Ali. He's slower than he used to be. He's more flat-footed. He's getting caught with shots that he never got caught with. But actually, you know, that Ali was correct in that Foreman was relying on his power by that point. Okay, Foreman had a good jab. He threw good uppercuts. He had some skills. He's an Olympic gold medalist. Okay, but over his career, a bit like, you know, many other fighters in boxing history, they get attached to the power. Okay, to where they don't need to develop too much more because they're just blowing everybody away. Well, I don't need to develop. I'm blowing everybody away as I am now. You know, people have aimed some of that same criticism at Wilder. He hasn't changed over a decade because he's just used to blowing people out. He's had no need to change. Okay, and you know, Foreman went into that. I mean, I think one of the bad things about it was Foreman showing up in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire, with German Shepherds. Now, that was not a good move, okay? Getting off the plane when he arrived in Zaire at the time, as it was known at the time, with German Shepherds, because German Shepherds were dogs that Belgian military and Belgian police used in their colonization of Zaire. The German Shepherd was seen as a symbol of the colonizers oppressing the people. So George Foreman getting off the plane with, I think, were it two German Shepherds, I think, you know, was not a great way to start. So, you know, the people seem to think Ali represented them more than Foreman. Some people in Zaire took it as Foreman is more representative of the colonials, okay, who have, you know, got us independence from. So all this build-up came and everybody were, you know, some bet makers, Ali was a huge underdog. Some bet makers thought, you know, we're stopping taking bets. This fight is a foregone conclusion, you know, and Ali cannot win. Many people all over the world said Ali cannot win this fight. He's going to get wiped out by Foreman. He's too slow now. He's too flat-footed. Now, Ali introduced the tactics. He came out initially. He was firing fast jabs and right hands, catching Foreman using that speed. But, you know, it was really hot. And Ali actually said in between rounds in his corner, "I can't keep moving like this, but I've got a plan." And basically he went out and laid on ropes. And this legendary fighter allowed one of the most destructive punches in boxing history, okay, to unload everything at him on the ropes. And a lot of those shots were blocked, but a lot of those shots got through as well. Okay, Ali took a lot of shots, especially a lot of body shots and some big booming head shots. He laid on those ropes and allowed one of the most devastating punches in boxing history to unload the kitchen sink at him. And his corner was screaming, "Get off the ropes, get off the ropes, what are you doing?" And he actually told it, he said in an old interview, I told my corner, "Shut up, I'm going to fight my way, I'm going to do it my way." Okay, and he did that. And Foreman, by round 5-6, after some major league assaults, was visibly tired. He was becoming more fragmented. And, you know, Ali took him out in that 8th round. And, you know, the world shook when Ali stopped Foreman. You know, the world just shook. I mean, this fight had an estimated audience of over 1 billion people, which were a quarter of the entire world's population. And although it's not the most viewed sporting event in history now, at that time it set a record as the most viewed sporting event in the world's history. Okay, when Ali fought Foreman. This fight as well took money. Not only, okay, did they get 5 million purses, which adjusted for inflation now is a huge purse, okay, for the time, but also that fight generated money that, if I recall, it were about 500 and something $million. So that fight, accounting for inflation, if that fight happened now, based on the numbers it generated, okay, generated over $500 million. I mean, that is an incredibly huge fight. So when you add to the historical aspect of the fight that Ali was a underdog, many people stopped taking bets. They said he could not win. Ali was convinced he would win. Okay. And only he, and even Angelo Dundee later said, even I was starting to think he's my guy off it, because, you know, Foreman's a major risk and he's talking about him like he's just going to whip him. But, you know, that's why this fight to me is my number one. It is one of the greatest upsets in boxing history, along with Turpin and Robinson. This is the second one. Whether I mention Robinson, Turpin first or this one first, those two are pretty much the first two when I mention biggest upsets in boxing history. And the Ali fight was a true global event, and I just love it watching interviews afterwards. He came to UK, Ali, a number of times. He traveled world, as we know, but a few times he came to UK and did like interviews with audience. There were one where he were asked a question by a great UK fighter called Len Harvey. Len Harvey actually said, "Oh, I'd have beat you, I'd have fought you." And Ali was saying, "Oh, you must have had quick hands to fight me." And Len Harvey said, "Yeah, I had quick hands, yeah." See, what a hell of a fighter. But Ali used to sit there and he were like, someone asked him about George Foreman. He said, "George Foreman, yeah, do we remember when George Foreman was scary?" And everybody laughed, you know, because Ali beat him. But yeah, you know, the upset, the build up to the fight, the menacing aspect of Foreman. And Foreman was another of the biggest punchers in boxing history that Muhammad Ali fought. You know, he fought Lyle, who were an underrated puncher. He beat Liston twice. You know, he beat Foreman, he beat Shavers. He fought all the great punchers. But to be one of the greatest punchers in heavyweight history in these circumstances, this is why this fight is my number one.
Oh, great call.
Sorry, I babbled a bit there, but I wanted to get some info out on it.
No, that's great. And I was actually watching this fight today, earlier on, and Ali, I think it was in the 4th. Ali hurts him in the 4th. Like, it wasn't like, if you read articles about it, like, they don't go round and round. You know, they're just like, oh, he was beating on him and then he came back and that was the fight. But Ali was putting that work in too. It's just who he was doing it against. But he was so good at rolling and slipping and bobbing, just doing everything, and just, you can see him playing with the guy's head, cool under pressure. You know.
Could I just add another point as well? The story Foreman told, where Foreman hit him right in chest with a big shot, and Foreman said, you know, he hit him in that fight with the hardest punches he'd ever delivered on a man. Okay, and this time it's a famous story. Foreman said he hit him right in chest, and Ali kind of looked at him and thought, "I'll get you," and then covered up. But another time, what you see in that fight is also, again, sorry, I forgot this. I've got to throw it in, guys. Sorry, I'm wittering. But another thing is the psychological aspect, because when you watch that fight, watch them in every clinch. Ali is talking in Foreman's ear like a babbling radio, like Ali did. He's wittering. You can see his mouth moving. You can see his gum shield while he's talking. He witters in Foreman's ear non-stop. You know, one of the famous quotes from it, were it in When We Were Kings, were it in that one, where George Foreman actually, or were it George Foreman or Ali, but one of them said, I think it was George Foreman, he said, Ali said to him, "Come on, sucker, I heard you hit harder than Joe Louis." You know, he taunting him. And another time he said he took a heavy shot and he just said, "Is that all you've got, George?" You know, the psychological aspect of Ali mentally destroying him and tiring him as well as his exertions. I always put the mental demolition of Foreman in that ring when he fought an opponent who not only took his biggest shots, but resented it and came after him for it and taunted him and mocked him and, you know, laughed at him and talked in his ear. I think that mental demolition of Foreman tired Foreman as much as the exertion. Now I'm finished.
That's a great point. And also, it's worth mentioning that when you're talking about guys this big, we see this in other rule sets, kickboxing and mixed martial arts as well. When guys are this big, you don't have to be the heaviest hitter to put damage on a human chin or like the organs inside our body. Like Ali did hit hard and he hit fast in combination, so he was able to stop people. He had a lot of finishes in his career, including against Foreman. So you don't have to be a big single shot guy to be the best at finishing people. Archie Moore put a lot of fellas out with combinations, as you guys all know. And he had just a slew of knockouts. It's not just about single shot power. It's about getting it in there. I think sometimes in the conversations today where people say Wilder would finish all these guys because how hard he hits, it's like, but can he deliver that to these guys who have that level of composure? I don't think so. I mean, I think someone like Ali would make him look a bit foolish because he does hit hard enough. You know what I mean? You can't just take shots from Muhammad Ali. Everyone found that out. If they did, they took too many, they went down. So I just wanted to mention that because I think some of the discussion today, they just think about the output and not the delivery system. Muhammad Ali had a fantastic offense and defense and was so smooth and clever. Just a special, one of the greatest of all time. And I think that brings us to Scrapbook's number one on your list, sir.
Let me first say 86. I wanted to congratulate you on that. Was a great breakdown that you just delivered there. It really was.
Thank you.
BL, same thing with you. I'm trying to see how I can fit in with this because you guys are bringing up some great points, and the points that you're bringing up are little details that make the picture a lot bigger than what the naked eye can see. And that's how you deliver these actual messages when you're talking boxing. So you guys are doing a splendid job, a great job.
Thank you,
Randall, this is such a great platform. My number one is the fight that happened June 22nd, 1938, and I'm just going to explain to you why. What was interesting about, I'll break down the whole lineup very quickly, and I'll tell you why this is my number one of all time. Man named Joe Louis. He falls out of a treehouse at the age of 4 and breaks his clavicle muscle. 12 years old in the 3rd grade. He's walking to his violin lessons one day with a very good friend of his. He pulls out a newspaper in the back pocket. He reads Kid Chocolate, takes on Al Singer, and earns $75,000. August 29th. Al Singer, New York City, 1929. Oh. Then he runs into a young man by the name of Walker Smith in Detroit. He carries his gym bag to Brewster Center. Why he does that is because Joe Louis's mother had a neighbor who actually worked across the street from the gymnasium. And Joe Louis is supposed to be going to his violin lessons. So he meets up with a young man by the name of Walker Smith. He meets him on the corner. They have this thing going for 3 months where Walker Smith would carry Joe Louis's bag to the gymnasium. Joe Louis has his violin bag, and as they turn the corner, they switch up. Then Joe Louis will wind up turning professional July 4th, 1934, against a fighter by the name of Jack Franklin. He would take on Primo Carnera in 1935 in New York's Madison Square Garden. That was his first fight at the Garden. Then he would take on Max Baer in 1935, the same year in New York's Yankee Stadium. June 19, 1936, at the New York Yankee Stadium. As a matter of fact, going back to Max Baer, he would get married to Marva Trotter several hours before he would fight that evening. Joe Louis at that particular time was thinking that he was the man. He really had things going his way that he can get married the day before Max Baer fight. Well, actually, a couple of hours before Max Baer fight. So June 19, 1936, New York Yankee Stadium, he would take on another former heavyweight champion, and his name was the Black Ulan, Max Schmeling. and he would be hit with 72 right hands. Why this was happening is because obviously he was training during that time. He wasn't taking things seriously. But as I came in my opening statement, I told you that he falls out of a treehouse at the age of 4 and broke his clavicle muscle. He kept on dropping his hand because that's the problem he had with that clavicle muscle on that side. So he could never really keep his hands up. Max Melling noticed it, and he timed it perfectly, 72 right hands. When you get to June 22nd, 1937, he would take on a fighter by the name of Jim Braddock at the Comiskey Park in Chicago, and he would knock him out in 8 rounds after being dropped himself earlier during that particular fight. What he did, if you break down the fight film, he actually knocked down the left hand of Jimmy Braddock with his with his left hook, excuse me. He knocked his left hand out of the way, and that's what was able for him to get the body shot off and then the right hand over the top. No one does anything like that. That's why I consider Joe Louis one of the greatest fighters of all time. He's a thinking man's fighter. He just had a disability that was exploited a few times in his career. June 22nd, 1938, he would meet a man by the name of Max Schmeling once again. And this was one of the great nights in boxing history. Why? Because there were 4 men that fought that evening. One of the men's name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the president of the United States from 1933 to 1945. He was the head of the Democratic Party. The other man's name was Adolf Hitler. He was a chancellor in 1933, and then he would become the Fuhrer in 1934. What was interesting about these 2 men was that Adolf Hitler was originally from Austria, okay? Then he would wind up becoming, like I said,
We seem to have lost Scrapbook again.
hello?
Oh, hiya. Scrapbook, are you still there? Everything went quiet for a minute.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah, my phone just cut off. I apologize.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. All right. So what happens now,
You guys hear me?
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at the age of 8, he studied school in Germany, but online learning. So they have all those connections going. So then when these 2 men would wind up meeting, Joe Louis would wind up knocking out Jim Braddock, but he didn't feel as though he was a champion because Joe Louis was a people's champion. He was a champion for the community in which he was involved in. And this is the first time that a black man during that time was needed by the entire world, or at least in his country, but also in other areas, because the Jews, as BL had eloquently stated, with the Kristallnachts, they were having a lot of problems over there in Germany. So Joe Louis was a symbol of success for a lot of people, and he was the man that actually was representing so many different symbols of life during that time. And these men would meet each other June 22nd in 1938, and that fight lasted just as much or just as long as the Mike Tyson and Michael Spinks fight. You know, what was interesting about this is that Joe Louis took it right to Max Schmeling, went right to him in a straight line, and Max Schmeling understood right then and there from the beginning of that round that he was in trouble, because Joe Louis had a different art of expression of his face, and he didn't really drop his hands like he did before. He practiced and practiced and rehearsed, and he wanted to make sure that he knocked this man out. Why? Because Arthur Donovan was the referee. He was called by the New York State Athletic Commission in the office. He said, "I don't give a damn. You do not stop this fight. It can cause a war. One man has to be completely flat and he can't move. You do not stop this fight." That's how serious it was, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt called Joe Louis down to the White House. He didn't invite him in the White House. He invited him into the front lawn. There was still that issue where Joe Louis couldn't even go into a White House. But he felt his arms and he said, "We need these muscles for democracy." So Joe Louis had the most pressure in any boxing history that evening, where the president would call him down, where all different forms of life was depending on Joe Louis to win that fight. Why was this important? Because in 1936, when Max Schmeling would defeat Joe Louis in 12 rounds, a couple of months later, the Olympics were in Germany. And Adolf Hitler was in the front aisle. He was in a special booth, smiling very proudly that it's in his country. And he wanted to see that Germany would dominate. Well, here comes Jesse Owens. He would earn 4 gold medals, and that actually put the icing on the cake. So when Joe Louis faced Max Schmeling, he had so many things going for him where he had no choice but to not only defeat Max Schmeling, but he had to knock him out. Because if there was a controversy or decision, it could start a war. You never had a fight like that in boxing history. What was amazing about this, the corner man, his name was Max Maxon. He would throw in the towel, and Arthur Donovan would pick up the towel and throw it, make an attempt to throw it out of the ring. It got caught onto the ropes because he was told by the State Athletic Commission, you cannot stop this fight. I don't care what happens to either fighter. I don't care who gets knocked out, but you can't stop the fight. Gross receipts was $940,006. The next gross receipts was $803,113. Joe Louis would earn $351,622. Max Schmeling would earn $175,622. This was probably one of the greatest fights, in my opinion. I have it #1 of all times, and that's why I chose this fight to be my #1 greatest fight in boxing history.
Fantastic shout out, Scrap. So let's see. Where does that bring us to? Where are we even? I'm so lost. Is this my #1 now?
You're number 5, Random. You are the last one. It's your number 5, buddy.
You're the last one.
This has been lots of fun. There are a lot of fights I left out. I had some others that I wanted to put in. I picked my 5 different ones, like especially like Hagler Hearns. Great fight on so many levels. This next fight, my #1 has already been brought up. This is a fight that would be difficult emotionally for a lot of people to actually watch were it surviving on film. I am talking about the 49-round war between great heavyweights Sam McVeigh and Joe Jeanette at a time when they were at the peak of their powers. It was the second of 3 fights they would have just in that 1 year. They split the series 1-1-1. And then this one, after just unleashing tremendous punishment on Jeanette, the Iron Man just kept it going and turned the fight around. What did you say, Biel? Was it like 24th round? He turned the fight. It sounds weird to even say that out loud.
24th round were when most knockouts were over for Jeanette. It were like approaching 28, 29, 30 into 32 that Jeanette really started to regain, to gain the full initiative.
Incredible. There have been other really long fights. There have been other really high-level heavyweight battles. But for me, this one stands out as just in fight terms. These are 2 of the 4 greatest heavyweights of this rich era. And this was their biggest collision. This was a finish fight. This means there wasn't going to be a draw. That means someone would not continue, and there was going to be a winner. And they fought this in Paris. And just for me, there's no footage of it, just some photos as has been mentioned. But to me, this is just a fight that I had. When I thought of my list, I was like, oh, Hagler Hearns, the greatest bit of action. But I'm thinking, what was the actual greatest battle? I think this might quite possibly be, for the reason that McVeigh was a crafty fighter, but it was fantastic at knocking people out, at delivering punishment. Jeanette was a little bit smaller, but he had the incredible endurance and also recovery. He could be hurt, but he couldn't be put away very easily at all. It was extremely rare, I should say. And in this fight, who knows how much of each of them they left in that. I mean, they kept fighting that year. They each have multiple fights after that, including against each other again. But this fight, this is just, if you're talking about hard man in a hard time for people in general, these guys got it on. So I had to give that my #1 shout. And that actually, we've now gone through our list. We made it, fellas, which is good. Just a couple minutes to spare.
Can I add one last thing to my conversation with the Joe Louis and Max Schmeling fight?
Please.
One last thing. 1933, both men, Adolf Hitler and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, would begin their political careers. In 1945, they were both in their careers because they both died the same year, as though their whole purpose in life was for this crazy thing that happened between these two men, as it became some kind of a movie, if you will. It is, if you look at it and break it down in its entirety, it has to be the most celebrated but yet complex case of boxing that you could ever find. And it was just amazing. So I just wanted to add that part to it because it's significant when you look at it in boxing. It really is.
Yeah, that's a great point. Do any of you gentlemen have anything you'd like to just touch on as far as the bouts that each of us brought up before we call it?
I don't believe so. I think really, I think all of us have done a great job in talking about these fights and trying to add, like Scrapbook alluded to earlier, trying to add some of the other moments that people don't talk about much that add to the flavour of the fights, what makes them historically significant. I think everyone has done a great job. I'm very content.
Oh, wonderful. It's been so great having you guys, and well done on the list. Thanks for everybody listening now and also listening after the fact. We appreciate you spending any time talking about the history of this great sport. And this sport is incredibly rich. I've been studying it for a few years now, and I'm only now realizing how little I know, even within the era I've been studying. So these were a lot of fun for me. This is an opportunity to break me out of my own little grooves and ruts that I get caught in as far as my very specific research. And shout out real quick, shout out to Customato, who trained Tyson, and sort of, you know, just a shout out for him being a great trainer and a great boxing mind. And also one more shout out for the great Jack Blackburn, because Joe Louis, that important fight. Where did he get the skills? Where did he get the ability from? Well, he had his natural drive and ability, but he got the skills from Jack Blackburn, one of the early era greats. And someone like Blackburn, for him to see how it is today, how the kind of money being slung around and the power that boxers of every skin tone have, you know, just a lot of these great fighters of the past and great coaches, they'd be amazed how it is today, how much better it is today for the athletes. Something to keep in mind when we're frustrated by negotiations. They're actually negotiating for huge amount of money. Some of these guys, some of these great fights of the past, even my number one, Jeanette McVeigh, that wasn't for huge money. It was for money, but it wasn't for huge money, even in that day. So,
Random,
someone commented. Someone commented. Oh no, it's okay, Scrap. Thank you. I just wanted to get this point in. Someone commented in comment section earlier, and I saw it. I can't figure out how to comment in there because it won't let me comment. I've seen 86 some random leaving comments, but I go into chat and there's nowhere for it to let me comment. So I don't know how you do that. But they mentioned a writer, Jack London. Scrapbook will know fully where I'm going with this now. Okay, but all I'd say is, by all means, read Jack London's articles, but keep in mind that Jack London was very racially divisive towards black people at that time, and he was like that with his articles. So by all means, read his articles, but try and read through them, okay, because he was very racially divisive to black people. I just want to get that in because, you know, Scrapbook will know back in that day, there were some writers who were very racially divisive. There were some writers who gave many black fighters incredible credit, you know, and then there were some in between, neither good nor bad. But always think about who you're reading as well. You know, Jack London was very knowledgeable on the sport, but he did have that racial divisiveness about him. So I never fully 100% trust what he says due to certain horrific articles of his that I have actually read. I just wanted to point that out.
That's a great point, BL. Scrap, you were saying something also. I've got something to say also after.
No, I'm sorry. You know, BL, great point. Great point. I just wanted to, not even 30 seconds of your time. I just wanted to say, with boxing, as far as boxing is concerned, my first fight that I ever went to was in '74, and it was in Inglewood, California. It was a fight between Alexis Aguayo and Ruben Oliveira, fighting for a title. And it was a 13 round. Oh, it was one of the greatest textbook fights if you ever want to watch one. Alexa Guerrero and Ruben Olivares. That was the very first fight that I ever went to. First time I ever had a program in my hand. It was a great, great fight. I was at the Bobby Chacon and Bazooka Limon fight in the very last round when Bobby Chacon would get Bazooka Limon, clutch him on his heels, and he would wind up stopping him. I was at the Bazooka Limon and Bobby and Cornelius Boozer Edwards fight. I was at the Marvin Hagler and Thomas Hearns fight. You're showing Tyson and Spinks. I was at that fight. I was at so many of these World Class Championship fights, but you can only fit so many on a list. There was so many great ones out there, but I just wanted to share that there was so many of them out there. Unbelievable, great fights. Shout out to boxing.
Yeah, well said, Scrap. That Arguello Olivares fight, you know, the finish from Arguello in that 13th round, one knockdown, ending with that uppercut. What a fantastic shot that was. But yeah, Arguello's a great fighter, one of the great knockout punchers in boxing. What an incredible first fight to go to Arguello and Ruben Olivares, who prior to Chavez was viewed by many as greatest Mexican fighter of all time. But the young Nicaraguan boy put him out, didn't he? Starting his own legacy of becoming a great champion himself.
Yes, he did. Yes, and I was also at the Arguello and Pryor fight, the first one. That was unbelievable. Also, 14 rounds of hell.
Yeah. Yeah, with the famous black bottle. Was it the black bottle? No, not that bottle. That one. I don't even want to know what goes on there.
Oh yeah, the one the guy says. Is that where the guy was like, "No, the one I mixed." You're like, "Ooh,
yeah.
Mixed."
Yeah, but you know, at the end of the day, no one knows. Pryor won. He had to get credit for win. You know, it was a great volley through. He just unloaded kitchen sink. And you know, when you watch Adam Pryor's fights with Arguello, Adam Pryor, he sets out at pace. That guy has a fast pace. He sets out at pace, and Arguello's under pressure immediately. So yeah, difficult fighter to fight, but it's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and I always look forward to our conversations. And big shout out to 86 Boxing. You did a great job tonight. Well done.
Yeah, this is so much fun, guys. Hey, and if I can just, one other thing I just want to mention, this particular picture on the left here, that's the earliest photo I've been able to find so far in my research of Joe Jeanette.
Yeah, it's Joe Jeanette, yeah.
That's from a 1905 article. That's the preview for his first fight with Sam Langford. So he's baby-faced in that one. I was always fascinated because I used to draw and paint portraits a little bit, and so I've always been fascinated by people's faces. So when I find a young picture in the archives, that's like the peak of my enjoyment as far as research, because we often see them later in later years when they're thin out, their skin's a little rough from all the punishments. Like baby-faced Joe Jeanette. I just wanted to mention that because I love that picture.
Yeah. Look at McVeigh's physique. He was a powerhouse. And he had thighs on him like tree trunks. I mean, he was a powerful guy.
That's right. And, you know, styles make fight. You know, BL. As all you guys know, McVeigh could, those jabs and hooks on the retreat. So when he was facing, say, heavier...
McVeigh was one of the great left hookers of his time. He had a great left hook. Yeah, he had a great right hand as well, but McVeigh had a great left hook. You know, Jeanette had a great jab because he had damage from an old injury to his right arm. He'd throw his right arm normally straight shot. So Jeanette developed a very cultured left hand. But yeah, McVeigh, one of the great left hookers of that time.
Yeah, scary guy, and able to, like, when he fought great Sam Langford fight on the retreat, he was a larger guy, and he was himself a knockout puncher. He was smart enough to know when, because people came straight at Langford, just had a bad night. So he adjusted and was able to draw with and also beat Sam Langford as well as lose to him. So just some great rivalries. The rivalry between, for me personally, at least from what I've seen so far, the rivalry between McVeigh, Jeanette, and Langford is like the greatest boxing rivalry, just in sporting terms, to me, of all time. That, as far as a three-way, it's incredible how many fights, how many rounds they fought against each other.
Yes, it is. It is indeed.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks again to everyone for listening. I'm about to get ready for work, as usual. I don't have any nights off, so it's definitely usual. This has been amazing. Are we going to shoot to do one another couple weeks, fellas?
Yeah, I'm all good. I'm all good. Again, I'd just like to say to the commenters, sorry, I am here this time. And I look forward to the next one with you guys. My YouTube highlight now.
Yeah, this is I look forward to these so much. Guys, let me know about the 2 weeks or if anything changes, and we'll get together via email to figure out a topic. Unless you want to do it live on air.
Yeah, we can throw some ideas around to each other. Come up with one. I'm sure that's cool.
I mean, we haven't done our greatest heavyweights of all time yet.
No, or the featherweights. That is a real headache one for your random. That one, trust me.
Also, there's top five performances of Stanford's career. Win, lose, or draw, just the top 5 performances. That'd be a heck of a list.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I'm sure we
greatest
can come up with
rounds.
something.
Okay, we'll get together and figure out something. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you to my 3 guests, 86 Boxing, Hardline Boxing Talk, aka the Boxing Librarian, Scrapbook Boxing. I so much appreciate your time. And thanks to everyone, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.